Snow drifts down across the city, blanketing everything in white as Christmas music fills the air and crowds move about in cheerful excitement. Among them, a family makes their way home. The father asks whether they enjoyed the day, and the little girl eagerly says that it was the best day ever. Their warmth is abruptly cut short when something blocks their path, a towering shadow stretching over them. The girl freezes as she stares up at the enormous man before them, and the father follows her gaze. The festive atmosphere disappears instantly, replaced by unease. The man's presence feels overwhelming. Juwon, moving through the same crowded street, notices the tension. His thoughts turn bitter as he questions why he always ends up shrinking back for others, then realizes that unlike everyone else here, he is alone. He keeps walking, intending to ignore everything as usual, but suddenly stops. His attention is drawn to someone else who is also alone. This time, he cannot simply pass by. A man dressed as Santa sits curled on the ground, holding a sign that asks passers-by to share their wishes. Juwon reflects that Christmas Eve is the very day he was left alone after losing his parents. Without thinking too much, he pulls some cash from his wallet and offers it along with a small snack, telling the man to take it. The Santa figure reacts with overwhelming joy, saying that the food is still good and calling Juwon a kind soul. However, his demeanor shifts abruptly as he grabs Juwon's hand tightly. He insists that he must repay this kindness and urges Juwon to tell him his wish. Juwon is taken aback, thinking that this is exactly why he avoids doing things out of the ordinary. He only wants the man to release him, but the grip is unyielding, almost painfully strong. The old man says that he cannot return home unless he grants a wish. Juwon, desperate to get away, asks if making a wish will make him let go, and the man immediately agrees. Trying to end the situation quickly, Juwon lies and says that he wants to win the lottery. The Santa figure rejects this, saying that it is not his true desire and demands honesty. Juwon falls silent, forced to confront what he truly wants. After a moment of hesitation, he admits that he wants a family, one that will stay by his side forever. He says that he wants a loving wife and a cute daughter. The Santa figure pauses, then says that he can sense the sincerity in Juwon's words and recognizes a soul that has been alone for far too long. He laughs, saying that he feels fortunate to have met someone like him, but then his tone sharpens, his gaze turning intense. He declares that he will find Juwon a wife as pure as snow and a daughter who will love her father. The promise no longer feels comforting, it feels unsettling, almost threatening. The Santa figure shouts that he truly hopes Juwon will live a happy life, but Juwon has reached his limit. He pulls his hand free with effort and leaves without looking back, muttering that the man is insane. He runs through the streets, convinced that the man has lost his mind. Behind him, the Santa continues shouting, promising to use all his power to grant the wish and claiming that an entire Santa village is rooting for him. Juwon eventually reaches the subway and boards it, trying to calm himself and forget the encounter, but the words linger in his mind. He questions what the man meant, dismissing it as madness, yet admits to himself that he made the wish because he wants to be happy like everyone else. His gaze drifts to posters of smiling families, and he closes his eyes, trying to shut out the longing. Suddenly, the atmosphere changes. A thick purple mist seeps into the train car, carrying a strange scent as the temperature drops sharply. Juwon senses that something is wrong. Pain surges through him, his head spinning as he struggles to remain conscious. When he forces his eyes open again, everything has changed. The subway is gone. He finds himself inside a wooden cage, jolting along in a horse-drawn carriage. Around him lies a village that feels ancient and unfamiliar. He grips the bars, realizing he is barely clothed. Confusion overwhelms him as he tries to understand where he is. Beside him sits an older man in tattered clothes, silent and exhausted. It becomes clear that this is not a dream. Other men fill the cage, all chained together. Juwon wonders if he has somehow been thrown into the Middle Ages. Guards approach, shouting in a language he cannot understand. The armor, the surroundings, everything resembles a medieval world. He finally accepts the truth that he is no longer in his own world. The cold bites into him as the shackles weigh heavily on his feet. He notices a motionless figure nearby and wonders if the man is dead. The silence is suffocating. Realizing he must survive, he apologizes under his breath and takes the dead man's clothes, pulling on the worn tunic to shield himself from the cold. As he lies back down, his thoughts return to the Santa's words about granting his wish. He questions whether this is the happiness he was promised or some cruel joke. Staring into the darkness, he wonders if he misunderstood what happiness truly means and silently begs to wake up, but no awakening comes. Time blurs as days turn into weeks. The carriage continues endlessly, carrying them toward an unknown destination. Juwon begins to understand his situation. Everyone in the cage, including himself, is a slave. The realization settles heavily as he concludes that they are being transported to be sold. Eventually, the carriage stops. The door opens with a harsh creak, and the guards order them out. They are lined up as a man, seemingly in charge, inspects them one by one, selecting those who appear healthy. Juwon bitterly acknowledges that he has become nothing more than property. Despite this, a small part of him feels hope. Being sold might be his only way out of the cage. He believes that his strength and condition will make him an easy choice. But as they travel from village to village, no one chooses him. The journey continues, dragging on without end. Exhaustion overwhelms him as he collapses onto the floor, questioning how his life has come to this point. He wonders if there is any reason left to live, fearing what will happen if no one buys him. In his despair, he recalls his mother's voice telling him to work hard no matter what. Thoughts of his parents surface, and he wonders if he can endure this suffering. Then he remembers the old man in red, promising to grant his wish with all his power. Bitterness rises within him as he curses both this world and his old one. He slams his hand down, deciding he is done waiting and hoping. If the world is cruel, he resolves to become even crueler just to survive. In that moment, he believes that true relief would be death. He grips a fork, pressing it close, ready to end everything. But hesitation stops him. He realizes that he does not want to die in a place like this. A memory of the family poster flashes through his mind, and he admits that he still wants to be happy. His hand trembles as he stops. He remains seated in the darkness, his thoughts drifting without direction, until a voice suddenly reaches him. Someone stands by the bars. A woman peers inside, extending her hand through the gaps. In it, she holds a fresh loaf of bread. She smiles at him gently, treating him like a human being despite the cage surrounding him. In this suffocating darkness, she becomes the first light he has seen in weeks. A little girl is hiding behind her mother. The fork slips from his hand and strikes the ground with a sharp clang. He no longer needs it. Elsewhere, deep in the forest, inside a quiet cabin, a simple meal is being shared. The young girl finishes everything in her bowl, yet it is clearly not enough. The woman across from her pushes her own portion forward, insisting that she eat more. The girl explains that she feels hungry, so Lizzie must feel it as well. Then she should be eating too. The fragile warmth of the moment is suddenly shattered as loud banging echoes against the door. The woman pulls the girl close as a voice calls from outside. It is the village chief. He instructs her to remain still and listen carefully. He explains that the village leaders have already decided her future. One of the men brought by the soldiers will become her husband, and the decision is final. She will have no say. By morning, a man will be chosen, and she will be sent to the mountains with him. She is also ordered to prepare food for the soldiers at daybreak. With that, he leaves, abandoning them to the weight of the news. The woman tightens her hold on the girl, overwhelmed. Everything has changed too quickly. She knows well the consequences of disobedience, the memory of past beatings making her body tense with fear. Running away is not an option, and although they have not been together for long, she cannot bring herself to abandon the child. The thought of leaving her alone again is unbearable. A faint sound breaks the silence, and the weight of her choice grows heavier. She resolves that no matter what happens tomorrow, she will not let go. The girl's cries soon fill the cabin, echoing in the darkness. The woman sinks to the floor, listening as the sobs gradually fade, her mind tormented by what lies ahead. She cannot bear to relive that nightmare. She clutches her clothes tightly, knowing she must feel the same fear. Eventually, the child drifts into an uneasy sleep, unaware of the decision looming over her. Morning approaches, carrying the promise of a new nightmare. The woman reflects on the little girl, a 5-year-old girl without even a name, known only as the daughter of a dead man. Seeing her reminds the woman of her own past. She recalls how her father sold her for a single rabbit skin, the measure of her worth. She remembers arriving at the hut for the first time, not even given a moment to settle before the man meant to be her husband began beating her for arriving late. That moment marked the beginning of her miserable life. She remembers collapsing on the cold floor, struggling to breathe, convinced she had nothing left. Then, a small presence approached. The child did not recoil in fear, but instead sat beside her, gently stroking her tangled hair. In that dark place, the little girl became the only one who reached out, the only reason she kept going. Later, the man left for the mountains and never returned. The villagers claimed wolves had taken him. For a brief moment, she felt relief, believing the monster was gone, but that feeling quickly turned to dread. In this world, a woman alone is defenseless, like prey outside a fence. Without a husband, there is no protection. The nightmare is not over. It has simply taken a different form. They head toward the center of the village, where a strange noise fills the air as people gather. The little girl points ahead excitedly, thinking it is just a carriage. But as it draws closer, the wooden bars become visible, revealing a cage. Inside, a man is chained like an animal. The woman stops in shock. A man is trapped. Seeing him reminds her of her late husband as he shouts that she is completely useless. A blow forces her down while he continues eating, mocking them for acting close despite barely knowing each other. Their bond disgusts him, and he claims that their behavior ruins his appetite. The woman instinctively pulls the little girl into her arms. Despite everything, she takes a piece of bread and approaches the cage, the girl following closely behind. Reaching through the bars, she offers the food. Juan looks up, and for a brief moment, silence settles between them. That moment is shattered as an elder approaches, calling out that she has finally arrived. Lizzie gasps softly as the tension breaks. The elder takes the bowl from her and instructs her to return to the village, saying the soldiers will be handled without her. She agrees and tells the child that it is time to leave. The girl follows obediently. Behind them, Juan remains silent as he takes a bite of the bread, the first he has had in a long time, though it does little to ease his hunger. Suddenly, heavy footsteps thunder across the ground as armored soldiers burst in, shouting orders. They demand that Juan get out of the cage. Before he can react, a violent strike sends him flying. He is kicked out like worthless trash, hitting the dirt face first with a pained groan. The soldiers are far from finished. In the village, captives are forced to kneel as a cold command signals the beginning of a slaughter. Without warning, blades cut into defenseless bodies, blood staining the ground as victims scream helplessly. One soldier calmly wipes his blade, making it clear that no one will leave alive. The soldiers produce strange glowing papers, emitting a blue light that confuses Juwon, who struggles to understand the magic before him. A soldier leans toward the elder, speaking in an unfamiliar language as they decide Juwon's fate. He remains kneeling in the dirt, looking up at the men who control his life. Later, sunlight filters through the trees onto a quiet village house. To an outsider, it appears peaceful, but to Juwon, it is just another cage. Elsewhere, the elder drops a heavy sack onto the floor and orders the woman to take it back to the hut. She explains that the village will provide for now, but every bit must be repaid. She then mentions the woman's new husband, noting that he does not speak their language. The elder adds bluntly that no one in the village ever liked her previous husband and only tolerated him because he guarded the mountain. This new man, however, is different. Though he appears intimidating, the soldiers claim he is merely a commoner. There is even a rumor that his hands are as soft as a noble's. The woman is left wondering who exactly has been brought into her home. The elder attempts to reassure her, saying that his hands suggest he has never struck anyone and that she should not fear his temper. She promises that if he works well, they will live comfortably. But comfort is not what the woman seeks. She only hopes that the man will not be violent. If he simply leaves them in peace, that would be enough. Her gaze falls on Lizzie, sleeping quietly. In that moment, her only wish is to keep the child safe. A sudden, violent banging shakes the door. The woman freezes, realizing he is outside, and the elder demands that she open immediately. Her heart sinks as the wooden door rattles, and she wonders if their nightmare is only just beginning. The chief forces the door open and announces that the man she is meant to marry has finally arrived. He orders the others to bring him in, and Juwon steps into the small room, staring around at the unfamiliar wooden walls in confusion. The woman looks at him and feels her chest tighten. Instinctively, she pulls the girl closer. Juwon is far larger than she imagined, almost like a giant inside their tiny home, and she wonders in fear if he is truly the man she must marry. Juwon's eyes fall on her, and he recognizes her as the woman who gave him bread. He watches her carefully, confused by her terror. Before either of them can react, the chief snaps at Juwon for standing still and pulls him forward. The old man forces them together as if they are livestock, then points to the floor and orders Juwon to remain there. He grabs the woman's hand and presses it into Juwon's, telling them to stop acting so stiff since they are going to be married. Then he steps back proudly, saying that the two of them look like a perfect couple. Juwon understands none of the words, but he can feel the weight of the situation. From the way everyone is watching them, a horrible suspicion forms in his mind. He wonders if this is some twisted fairy tale, if they are trying to hand him a wife with a heart as pure as snow and a daughter who will love her father, just like the Santa promised. He looks at the fragile, rabbit-like bride and the small, watchful girl beside her, unable to believe what is happening. He wonders whether that Santa had truly been real and whether his wish was actually granted. Yet if it was, the gift came with a cruel price. He was dragged into another world, stranded, enslaved, and forced into a family he never asked to receive this way. Juwon thinks that if he ever finds that Santa again, he will make him pay for this. He may have been given a family, but he has also been thrown into a world where he understands nothing. His anger terrifies the duo beside him. The chief seems satisfied and begins to leave, but a man beside him approaches Juwon and extends a hand. Juwon assumes the man wants to shake hands, so he reaches out. The man tightens his grip, and Juwon has no idea what is happening and thinks it may be a local greeting, so he squeezes. However, the man suddenly screams and collapses as if Juwon crushed him, even though Juwon barely touched him. Clapping, the elder approaches. He pulls out a bow. Instead of attacking, the chief eventually gives him the bow. Juwon does not understand whether this is a challenge until the man begins gesturing like a rabbit. Juwon finally realizes he is being taught to hunt. Soon, a real rabbit appears. The chief urges him to shoot, shouting desperately for him to take the shot. Juwon is pushed forward, but there is one major problem. He has never used a bow in his life. He remembers hearing that even Olympic archery is difficult, so he knows this is going to end badly. He tries anyway. The arrow misses, but the power is impressive. The rabbit is startled. The chief explodes in excitement. Juwon cannot understand the words and only grows more confused. As the chief continues yelling, Juwon notices someone approaching. The hair and clothes are unmistakable. He realizes it is the woman and the child again. He understands, from the situation more than the language, that this woman is being presented as his bride. He can barely look at her, overwhelmed by the absurdity of it all. One moment he is failing miserably at hunting, and the next he is sitting quietly with them as if they are sharing a picnic. The woman waits for him to eat. The meal is simple, but it feels unbearably heavy. Juwon thinks he is supposed to be some kind of warrior in this world, yet right now he is only a man trying to understand how he suddenly ended up with a family. The word itself feels strange to him. From middle school until he turned 30, he had always been alone. Waking up by himself had been normal. Now, someone like him has a family. It did not happen naturally, and the timing is completely wrong. He still wants to find the Santa who dropped him here and settle things with him, but when he looks at the woman and the child, he wonders if this twisted order of events might not be entirely bad. For now, he decides he has no choice but to make it work. Despite everything, he feels grateful for the moment, almost as if it were a dream. Reality strikes the very next day. Everything moves far too quickly. Juwan carries their belongings on his back, but he is not worried about himself. He keeps glancing back at the woman and child, noticing how hard they are struggling just to keep up. He wants to ask if they are all right and help them, but he cannot speak their language. The helplessness frustrates him. He is supposed to be their protector, yet he cannot say a single word to them. He knows he cannot remain like this forever. He must learn this world quickly and master it if he wants to survive. He remembers his mother telling him that if he wants to protect someone, he cannot hesitate. The moment he feels the urge to help, he must run to that person immediately. Juwan realizes he has been walking ahead, trapped in his own thoughts while they fall behind. The child trembled and whimpered, clutching her hands near her chest as fear filled her eyes. Juwan crouched before them and gently says that he is going to hold them for a moment, asking them not to be scared. The young woman stiffened in shock, staring at him with a pale face. She anxiously says something in a language he cannot understand, while the little girl bursts into a frightened cry. Seeing their reaction, Juwan thinks that he should not keep such a blank expression for now. He realizes they are this frightened just because he approached them, so he softly says to pardon him for a moment. Without waiting longer, he carefully lifts them both. The young woman gasps in alarm as he supports her with one arm, while the child cries out when he picks her up with the other. For a moment, both of them panic, but Juwan steadies them on his back along with the luggage and begins walking. The young woman slowly realizes he is not hurting them. Her fear softens into surprise, and then into a small, relieved smile. Juwan carries them easily, one on each side, while the little girl clings to the bundle and looks around in wonder. The girl makes a startled sound when she notices the height, and the woman quickly tells her to hold on tight. As Juwan walks, he thinks that even with the luggage and both of them on his back, they do not feel heavy at all. He wonders if they are far too light. Looking ahead, he decides that he must learn the language and hunting as quickly as possible, so he can feed them plenty of meat. He tells himself that he is going to be busy from here on out. The woman remains quiet against his shoulder. After a moment, she hesitantly reaches toward his face and brushes his hair aside near his ear. Her fingers tremble as she touches him, then she pulls back, looking conflicted and embarrassed. Juwan does not say anything, and the three continue through the forest. After following the guide to a small, worn cabin hidden among the trees, Juwan bows and says that he is grateful for being shown the way. The old man replies in words Juwan cannot understand, then turns and leaves them behind. Juwan watches him go, then looks up at the broken cabin. He thinks that this is where they will be living now, and that the place will probably be even colder than his old rooftop room. Inside, the cold hits him immediately. Juwan shivers and thinks bitterly that he hates the cold, that he always hated it, and now he hates it even more. He looks around the cabin and finds it nearly stripped bare. When he opens another door, he freezes in confusion. The young woman appears inside, tears already running down her face. Juwan is startled and asks why she is crying. She says nothing. Instead, she turns away and runs out, leaving him standing there without understanding. While she had been down in the village, everything had been taken. The shelves, the table, the bed, the armor, the mirror, the hammer, every last useful thing. She realizes that the cold will only get worse, and without tools, she will not even be able to repair the house. More importantly, if a beast appears now, she has no way to defend them. Juwan eventually finds the young woman sitting outside in the golden light of sunset. Juwan sits beside her and gently places a hand on her head. He tells her not to worry. The young woman stares at him, wondering if he is telling her not to worry. His hand remains warm and steady on her hair. She thinks about the man she now has to live with. They cannot communicate, and despite supposedly being a mountain dweller, he does not even know how to hunt. She wonders if they can truly survive together in a place this harsh. Juwan smiles faintly and says that he will protect her. Her eyes widen. She feels anxious and full of doubt, and yet his words make her strangely relieved. Tears gather again as she wonders why she feels so comforted by him. Juwan looks at her and remembers his original world. He thinks that he was alone every day after his parents passed away, but even then he struggled and endured to survive. Now that he even has a family, he believes there is no reason he cannot endure this too. He tells her not to worry and says that he will do whatever it takes to provide for them. The young woman watches him for a long moment, then lets out a soft sob. She lowers her head and cries while Juwan pauses. The little girl suddenly runs toward them in panic, crying that she is sorry again and again. She throws herself between them and shouts for him not to bully Lizzie, pressing herself against the young woman as if trying to protect her. Kim Juwan sits frozen, staring at the crying woman in his arms and the child sobbing beside her. He thinks that a woman crying in his arms and even a child crying next to him are both things completely unfamiliar to him. His mind fills with questions. He wonders whose child she is. why the woman gave him bread before, and why she had been crying. But even through the confusion, he decides that if they keep living together and try, they will definitely become a good family. Holding them gently, he says that he will make them happier than anyone else, and that he will never let the two of them cry again. He silently vows to become a good husband and a good father, so neither of them will ever regret becoming his family. Later, inside the cabin, the three sit awkwardly on the wooden floor. Juan thinks that after leaning on each other and crying, he expected them to be a little closer, but they are back to square one. Still, he feels relieved that they now look wary instead of terrified. Since they are going to live together, he wonders where he should begin. He suddenly realizes something simple and points to himself. He says that his name is Kim Juan. The two flinch at the sound, but he repeats it slowly, separating the syllables so they can understand. He thinks that even if they cannot communicate, they should at least know one another's names since they will be living together from now on. Lizzie hesitantly repeats his name as Kim Ju Hwan. Juan smiles and says that she should tell him her name. She holds a hand to her chest, trembling slightly, then quietly says that she is Lizzie. When he does not catch it clearly and reacts in confusion, she repeats that her name is Lizzie. Juan brightens and says that Lizzie is a pretty name. Then he turns to the little girl and asks for her name as well. The atmosphere immediately grows strange. Lizzie stiffens, and the child lowers her gaze, clutching her dress in silence. Juan notices their reaction and wonders why the mood suddenly feels weird. He realizes the child may not have a name yet. After a pause, he gently reaches out and says that he will give her one. Placing his hand on her head, he calls her Dorothy. In his mind, he remembers the girl from The Wizard of Oz, the one who goes on adventures with many friends and finds her own happiness. He hopes this child will grow into a lovely girl like that. The little girl slowly repeats the name, uncertainly saying, Dorothy. Juan smiles and tells her that it is a name that will let her meet many good friends and loved ones. Her eyes sparkle, and she smiles brightly as she repeats Dorothy again. Afterward, Juan starts chopping firewood outside the cabin. Lizzie watches from behind a tree, quietly observing him. She thinks he is a very strange man. Even though he has a much bigger body and much larger hands than the man who died, he does not hit her. Instead, he treats her kindly. She thinks that he is completely different from the people she has known, almost like a different kind of person. She softly tries saying his name, calling him Juan. Lizzie thinks she does not know what language his name comes from, but the pronunciation sounds refined, and his voice is gentle. She remembers that she has never received kindness like this even once. As she watches his warm smile in her memory, she wonders why that man is being kind to her. Juan notices her and reacts in surprise. Looking at him from across the clearing, she thinks that no matter how she considers it, he does not belong in a place like this. He raises his hand and calls Lizzie's name with a smile. Lizzie stares at him, suddenly focusing on his black-looking hair and dark eyes. She remembers rumors she had heard about a country at war succeeding in summoning a hero. People had said the enemy nation was celebrating because the legendary summoning had truly worked, and some claimed that the hero had black hair and black eyes. As Juan walks toward her, Lizzie wonders if the legendary hero with black hair and black eyes really exists. For a brief moment, she thinks he looks similar. But then she rejects the idea, telling herself that such a hero would never be in a place like this. Someone like that should be in a grand palace, not living as a mountain keeper in a village like theirs. Besides, it is still only a rumor. When he comes closer, she realizes his hair is closer to brown than black, and his eyes are not quite what the rumors describe either. She feels relieved, thinking he is only a large man compared to others. Then she catches herself and wonders why she feels relieved at all, since they only met today. Juan gently places his hand on her head. Lizzie flinches in shock. She is not used to this. In her life, there had been only one reason for a man's hand to be placed on her head, and that was always to hit her. But Juan's hand does not strike, it only pats her carefully. Lizzie's eyes soften as she realizes it feels nice. She silently wishes he would pat her more and keep going. Juan, meanwhile, notices the intimacy of what he is doing and becomes embarrassed, blushing as his hand remains awkwardly on her head. Lizzie's face softens under Juan's hand, her eyes hazy and her cheeks flushed. For a moment, she only stares up at him as if she has forgotten how to move. Then, as he leans closer without thinking, their faces come too near, and his lips brush against her. Both of them freeze. Lizzie's eyes widen in shock, and Juan immediately realizes what he has done. The gentle mood shatters at once. Lizzie stiffens as if she has turned to ice, unable to move or speak, while Juan jerks back with a pale face. He stammers in panic, unable to form proper words. Desperate to escape the awkwardness, he notices a wooden bucket nearby. He grabs it, turns away, and runs into the forest at full speed. Lizzie watches him flee, stunned and red-faced. As he rushes down the path, Juan curses himself, thinking that he must be seriously insane. He wonders what Lizzie must be thinking of him now. Even if they are technically married, they only met that day. They cannot even communicate, so he has no idea what he should do. He wonders if he should simply act as if nothing happened. After running for a while, he finally slows down. Looking around at the darkening forest, he realizes he has gone too far. He asks himself how far he has come and where he even is. Deciding that he should quickly get water and head back, he turns with the bucket in hand. Then a strange sound echoes through the trees. Juan stops. In the darkness, a massive wolf steps out, its red eyes glowing and its body far larger than any normal animal. The beast growls low, baring its fangs. Juan stares at it in disbelief and thinks that it is a wolf. He crouches and slowly reaches for a thick piece of wood on the ground. His fingers tighten around it. The moment the wolf lunges, he grips the branch hard and raises it like a weapon. The wolf charges straight at him with a roar. Juan plants his feet and swings the branch down with all his strength, striking the beast and forcing it back. But the monster recovers quickly and rushes again. Its jaws snap toward him, and Juan throws his arm forward, barely holding it off. He shouts in rage, asking if the beast thinks he is going to die in a place like this. His body moves desperately as he fights back, refusing to be torn apart. He yells that he is not dying. The wolf's fangs bite into the wood and close in on him. Pain and heat surge through Juan's body. He feels as if his entire body is on fire. Then, suddenly, his arm truly bursts into flame. Juan stares in shock, wondering what is happening. Fire wraps around his arm, yet it does not burn him. The wolf recoils, snarling as the flames strike it. Juan does not stop. With the burning power covering his arm, he climbs onto the beast and pounds it again and again. The wolf thrashes under him, but he keeps hitting until the flames and blows overwhelm it. At last, the monster collapses. Its body lies still on the ground, blood spreading beneath it. Juan falls back onto the grass, exhausted and breathing hard. He thinks back to the strange moment from earlier and realizes he definitely saw his arm catch fire. He lifts his hand and examines it carefully. There are no burns on his skin, and even his clothes are unharmed. Confused, he wonders if he just used magic. The thought reminds him of common stories where people sent to another world gain special powers. He recalls the soldiers from before and the glowing papers they used, realizing this world already has something like magic. If so, perhaps he has gained it too. Trying to test the idea, Juan raises his hand toward the sky and calls for a fireball. Nothing happens. He tries again and again, calling for a fireball repeatedly, but the forest remains silent. Still lying on the ground, he keeps experimenting. He calls for a firestorm, a fire wall, fire magic, dragon breath, and even asks the spirits of the vast earth to arise. He then calls for fire fairies to grant him strength. Nothing happens. Juan goes quiet, embarrassed by his own attempts. Even so, he knows it was not an illusion. His wounds have healed a little, perhaps because of the magic. He studies his hand again and thinks that if he can learn to control it, it will definitely help him provide for his family as a hunter. He imagines bringing better food home, giving Lizzie and Dorothy a better life, and making them truly happy. Lying beneath the dark forest sky, exhausted but alive, Juan realizes that this strange power may become the key to protecting them. Juan lies beside the dead wolf and raises his hand, thinking that in these mountains, where there is no doctor, magic could help them instantly if he learns to use it. He slowly stands, brushes himself off, and tells himself to take it one step at a time. If it happened once, he believes it will happen again. His thoughts drift to the past. Not long after his parents passed away, his grandfather left his side as well. Although the old man had still been vigorous, he died in a senseless accident after taking Juan in. At the funeral, his relatives shoved him and screamed that everything was his fault. One man shouted that his only brother and his father died because they lived with him, while others glared down and accused him of causing all of it. Juan remembers how his relatives treated him, a middle schooler at the time, like a plague that brought nothing but death. Returning to himself, he silently kneels beside the wolf and decides that he should drain the blood first, though he does not want to attract other predators. After that, he lifts the heavy beast over his shoulder and decides to head home before it gets any later. He knows processing the hide will be tough, but he can at least skin it for now. As he walks beneath the moon, he remembers how his grandfather butchered chickens and rabbits. He never expected watching him back then would become useful. He thinks his grandfather would have been proud to see him like this. Then he raises his hand and wonders how he is supposed to train his magic. Back at the cabin, Lizzie works near the hearth while Dorothy excitedly brings her a bowl. Lizzie thanks Dorothy, and the little girl beams as Lizzie pats her head. Dorothy giggles happily, then runs around the room with pride. Later, Dorothy hears a noise from the window. Curious, she climbs up and peeks out. The moment she sees the wolf's face outside, she screams in terror. Lizzie whirls around in alarm and cries Dorothy's name. She grabs a knife and orders Dorothy to get back, rushing toward her. But before she can reach the window, Juan appears outside with the wolf slung over him. He groans from the weight, and Lizzie calls his name in shock. Seeing him near the beast, she screams no and runs outside, shouting that he cannot do this. Juan notices her and Dorothy and asks for them by name, confused by their panic. Lizzie staggers toward him with tears in her eyes. When she sees the blood and the wolf's limp body, her knife drops to the ground. She rushes into Juan's arms and sobs, while Dorothy clings to him and cries too. Juan quickly assures Lizzie that he is okay, saying that he is not hurt, then corrects himself and says he was hurt but is fine now. He gently explains that it was only a bite on the arm and that he is okay. As moonlight settles over them, he tells them not to worry because he is really okay. Lizzie clings to him and says she is so glad he is safe. Juwon freezes in surprise as she hugs him tightly. Dorothy also sobs that she was so worried. Juwon realizes Lizzie keeps repeating that she is relieved, and because Dorothy is making a similar sound, he understands that they were both worried. He remembers his own promise that he would not make them cry, and the weight of it presses on him. The next morning, birds cry over the forest roof while Juwon works outside. He lays the wolf on a table and begins skinning and cutting it. He thinks it looked easy when his grandfather did it, but doing it himself takes far longer than expected. Deciding he needs another method next time, he wipes his sweat and tells himself to wrap it up. As he cuts the meat into pieces, Lizzie calls his name from the doorway. Juwon turns and asks for Lizzie. She walks toward him carrying a large wooden tub and explains with gestures that he should put the meat inside. At first, he is confused, but when she mimics placing meat in the tub, he realizes she wants him to put the meat there. Juwon wonders how to say thank you in their language again. After thinking hard, he awkwardly tries to thank her. Lizzie pauses, startled by the strange pronunciation. Juwon wonders if he said something wrong. Lizzie then points to herself and carefully teaches him the word for thank you. Juwon listens, repeats it, and smiles down at her. Lizzie looks up at him, her expression softening as the two stand close beneath the bright forest light. Lizzie quietly says that he is welcome, but the simple exchange leaves her shaken. As she stands before him with the tub, she thinks that being thanked is something she has never heard from her parents or siblings, even though all she did was bring him a water bucket. She realizes that ever since meeting him, she's been experiencing one first after another. She thinks of their first kiss, too, and admits to herself that it is terribly embarrassing, yet also a little wonderful. Then another thought stings her. She wonders whether this was really his first time too, whether he had kissed other women before, and whether other women felt this way about him. For some reason, the thought hurts. Her heart races, and she feels as though she might cry. Inside the cabin, the two of them work side by side, placing the meat into the tub. Lizzie keeps stealing glances at him and thinks that everything about him feels strange. She cannot understand why he treats kindness and consideration as something so natural. The more she watches him, the more flustered she becomes. When their eyes meet, she panics. She wonders what she should do and suddenly suspects that he might lean in again. In her confusion, she instinctively closes her eyes. He comes close once more, plant a soft kiss on her forehead. The instant it is over, Lizzie burns with embarrassment and scolds herself, thinking that she was foolish for closing her eyes. She panics that she might have looked like she was expecting a kiss on the lips. Then he leans close again. Lizzie steels herself and thinks that this time she will not close her eyes and will not let him misunderstand. He moves in once more, but this time he kisses her for real and she stands frozen, flushed, and speechless. Just then, he hears Dorothy nearby and turns in surprise. Lizzie immediately realizes that Dorothy may have seen everything and the shame overwhelms her. She runs away while internally crying that it is far too embarrassing. Not long after, Juwon walks outside carrying the tub while Dorothy trails after him, lightly holding onto him. He casually thanks her, but Dorothy looks downcast. Juwon pauses and asks what is wrong. Then he realizes that perhaps the problem is that he thanked her without calling her name. He corrects himself and says that he is thankful for Dorothy's help. At once, Dorothy brightens and smiles happily. Back inside, Lizzie begins dealing with the wolf hide. The smell is strong, and Juwon quietly watches her work. He thinks that the hide must be precious to her if she is drying it indoors like that. Dorothy reaches out curiously toward the hide, and Lizzie smiles warmly beside her. Watching them, Juwon notes that Lizzie looks genuinely happy. As Lizzie works with the meat and fat, Juwon carefully observes what she is doing. He realizes that this is how she cures it, and decides that next time he will watch even more closely and try doing it himself. He also notices that she seems especially pleased about the fat. He reflects that he kept it just in case and is glad he did. Sitting back, he thinks that there is still so much he needs to learn and do. He lists the things he still has to understand, such as what counts as wealth and how buying and trading work in this world. Wanting to master these things as quickly as possible, he decides that he should stop resting and return to work. When he gets up to leave, Lizzie quickly steps in front of him and gestures for him to sit back down. Juwon looks at her and asks if she wants him to remain seated. Realizing that she is worried about his injury, he explains that he is fine now, that he has rested enough, and that it no longer hurts much. He gently touches her shoulder and reassures her that he will not overdo it and that she should not worry. Lizzie can only stand there in silence as he leaves. Outside in the woods, Juwon looks over the trees and decides that one of them seems like the right size for practice. He remembers hearing that oak makes the best firewood, though he admits that he still does not know which tree is actually oak. Even so, he grips the axe and tells himself that although he has never chopped wood before, he is confident in his strength. He swings with all his might, but the attempt goes badly. The axe head flies off, leaving him stunned into silence. Even so, he does not give up. Sometime later, he returns to the cabin carrying a large load of wood on his back. When Lizzie and Dorothy see him come in like that, both are startled. Lizzie hurries toward him in concern, but Juwon quickly tells her that he is fine. He crouches in front of her and calmly repeats that there is nothing wrong, trying to ease her worry. Lizzie softly tells Juwon that she is thankful. Dorothy, who has been watching the two of them from behind, suddenly scurries away. She grabs water and comes running back, splashing and sprinkling it all over the floor as she hurries over. Juwan crouches in confusion as Dorothy enthusiastically sprays him, and he can only ask what is going on. Lizzie covers her mouth and laughs at the sight. Dorothy looks delighted with herself, and Juwan smiles, pats her head, and thanks Dorothy. When she looks ready to keep going, he hurriedly tells her that it is enough now and that she can stop. As the three of them remain huddled together, Juwan thinks that it feels like a dream. He reflects that only a few days ago, he never thought he would experience happiness like this again. He then vows inwardly that, as happy as he is now, he wants to keep Lizzie and Dorothy smiling too. Night falls over the cabin. Smoke curls from the chimney while the three sit around a simple meal. Dorothy nods off first, asleep beside them while Lizzie and Juwan share a quiet, warm moment. Juwan gently lifts the sleeping Dorothy into his arms and carries her away. He carefully lays her in bed, smooths her blanket, and pats her head while Lizzie quietly cleans up the kitchen. Afterward, Lizzie continues working by the hearth with a cloth in her hand, but when Juwan comes near, she suddenly reaches out and catches him. He looks startled as she draws close. Standing before him in the quiet room, she carefully cleans his body with a wet cloth. Lizzie thinks that she should not be shy and that this is what a wife is supposed to do. Still, her face burns, and she admits inwardly that she is far too embarrassed. Juwan watches her with a gentle smile while she fidgets in front of him, flustered and unsure. The atmosphere grows heavier and softer. He takes her hand, and the two move even closer. With a quiet smile, he tells her that they should go to sleep now. Hand in hand, they head toward the bedroom together. In the dim light, the two end up close on the bed. Their bodies brush, and a hush falls between them. Lizzie blushes furiously, and Juwan can only stare at her. When he leans in and kisses her, her whole body trembles. The feeling of her in his arms leaves him dazed, and he thinks that she is incredibly soft. As he holds her, he realizes with a strange tenderness that this woman really is his wife. That thought stirs a deeper fear in him. Looking at Dorothy sleeping nearby, he silently prays that at least these two will not leave this world before he does. He begs Santa that they be allowed to stay, to keep smiling, and to remain with him until the moment he dies. Lizzie's thoughts then drift elsewhere. She reflects that lords and wealthy nobles might not understand, because they have many rooms and servants, but commoners live differently. In homes like theirs, every child grows up in the same cramped space as their parents, and cannot help knowing how a husband and wife spend their nights. That thought draws her back to childhood. She remembers her father's furious shouting and the terror of hearing him threaten to hit harder if the crying did not stop. She remembers how, once he fell asleep, her mother's muffled sobbing would continue until dawn. Curled beside her mother in bed, the younger Lizzie would wonder when her nights would finally become quiet. She feared that her mother's sobbing would one day become her own future. The sound of crackling fire pulls her awake. She slowly opens her eyes and realizes she is lying in bed. Startled, she wonders when she got there at all. Then she sees Juwan and Dorothy beside her under the same blanket and thinks in surprise that she had been certain she fell asleep on the floor. Lizzie wakes in bed and realizes that Juwan is even letting her use his arm as a pillow. Dorothy is pressed against her other side, sleeping peacefully while clinging to her. Looking at the two of them, Lizzie thinks that she is so relieved. She reflects that the nights she had known between a husband and wife were never this sweet, and that ever since she met this man, her world has been changing. She quietly studies Juwan's sleeping face and chest, but then he stirs with a soft murmur. The sudden movement startles her, and before she can react, his arm pulls around them more tightly. Cradled in his embrace with Dorothy tucked in as well, Lizzie feels her heart throb so hard that she thinks it might explode. Her chest tingles, and she wishes that this moment could last forever. Morning light enters the room. Juwan wakes first, gently sits up, and carefully adjusts Dorothy so she can keep sleeping. Lizzie comes in holding a metal bucket, and Juwan takes it before splashing it over the fireplace. Then, with an awkward but deliberate attempt, he greets Lizzie and asks whether she slept well, calling her honey. Lizzie freezes, her whole face turning red. Seeing her reaction, Juwan wonders if she is blushing because of the title. He thinks about names like darling, honey, and husband, then asks what Lizzie wants him to call her. Lizzie fidgets in embarrassment before finally, with great effort, asking him to call her honey. Juwan immediately says that he understands and cheerfully calls her honey. Lizzie becomes even more flustered, covering her mouth in shock, while Juwan thinks that her reaction is so cute that he wants to tease her more. He steps behind her, lightly pokes her, and asks his honey to look at him. Before the moment can continue, Dorothy wakes up with a whine. Still half asleep, she seems to dream of food, muttering about meat before tumbling from the bed and running straight toward them. Juwan and Lizzie turn in surprise as Dorothy charges over. The moment she spots the meat, her eyes shine. She excitedly exclaims that it is meat, then keeps repeating the word with childish delight while climbing into the bucket. Juwan laughs at her enthusiasm. Watching Dorothy beam at the sight of meat, he decides that it is time to get serious about hunting. Armed with an axe, he heads into the forest. He thinks that even if that wolf comes again, he does not care and is ready for it now because he has a reliable weapon. But as he walks deeper in, he suddenly feels that the air is strangely heavy. He tightens his grip on the axe and thinks that he is in the middle of a vast forest, yet it is so oppressive that he can barely breathe. He wonders what kind of monstrous beast is coming this time. Then he notices footsteps. A figure appears ahead of him in the dim woods, wrapped in a dark hooded cloak. As the man comes closer, Juwon grows tense and asks who is there. The man stares back with a stern look. A little earlier, the focus returns to the mysterious hooded elder moving through the forest alone. He stops among the trees, his eyes fixed on the dark bloodstains scattered across the earth. He slowly crouches and studies the marks without speaking. After examining the ground, he concludes that the blood is mixed with traces of a beast. The tracks remain too clear to ignore, and judging from their size, the creature that left them must have been enormous. The elder continues deeper into the woods, silently connecting each detail he has gathered over the past few days. Even if someone had helped him, surviving an encounter like this should have been almost impossible. Yet the giant man he's been observing does not look like someone familiar with hunting or weapons at all. That makes every clue feel even more unbelievable. Soon he finds more blood along the trail. He pauses again, staring down at it with narrowed eyes. The idea that a man with no proper skill could kill a giant beast alone feels absurd. Even experienced hunters, armed with the right tools, would struggle against prey of that size. Determined to confirm the truth with his own eyes, the elder follows the trail until the memory reaches the moment he first met Juwon. The two men stand facing each other in silence, but the elder's gaze is not on Juwon's face. It remains locked on his injured hand. He studies the wounds carefully, reading the marks with the eyes of someone who has seen many injuries before. From the shape of the scars, he can tell they were definitely caused by wolf bites. But the condition of the wounds is what unsettled him most. Injuries deep enough to expose bone should have rotted, caused fever, or left lasting damage. A man bitten that badly should not be standing normally, much less walking through the forest as if nothing happened. Yet Juwon is fine, the elder's thoughts sharpen. There are mages in this world, rare people ordinary villagers might live their whole lives without meeting. If Juwon truly possesses such power, then fate has placed before him an opportunity he never expected to receive again. Beneath his hood, a dark smile spreads across his face as decades of buried resentment begin to stir. Juwon, meanwhile, grows more uneasy the longer he stands before the old man. The hooded elder begins recalling his past. When he was young, he dreamed of becoming a proper mountain keeper, someone trusted to manage the forests of a noble. Men in that position were often sent to war, and those who proved themselves would rise higher, even becoming retainers under powerful lords. With that ambition driving him, he left his father behind and wandered from village to village, taking work as an independent hunter. Eventually, he became the keeper of a prosperous mountain region, a place rich with game and filled with thick forests. At first, it seemed like everything he had wanted. The only problem was firewood. The villagers lacked enough of it, so they had to travel deeper into the mountains to gather more. Back then, the young hunter saw it as a chance to learn the terrain better. He never questioned why the villagers only dared to collect wood near the edge of the mountain. That ignorance destroyed his life. To become an official forest keeper, a person needs all 4 limbs intact, but before his contract could be completed, he failed that condition. The reason, he says bitterly, was because goblins lived in that mountain. Hatred fills his expression as he describes them. He explains that goblins abduct human women and force them to bear children. Only afterward did he learn that the nearby villages had long been known for disappearances connected to a hidden goblin settlement in the mountains. By the time he understood the truth, his own life had already been ruined. Everything he had dreamed of was taken from him. For decades, he endured that loss with only one purpose, keeping him alive, revenge against the goblins who destroyed his future. As the elder looks at Juwon in the present, his thoughts grow darker. Juwon possesses abnormal strength, and his healing borders on the impossible. To the old man, that makes him the perfect weapon. Deep within the mountains, the goblins are still hiding. The elder believes it is only a matter of time before they attack nearby villages again in search of women. Before that happens, he intends to shape Juwon into an exceptional hunter, someone strong enough to destroy them. But he deliberately hides the truth about the goblin den. Once a formal hunting contract is made, Juwon will no longer be able to walk away so easily. During their exchange, Juwon politely bows his head in greeting. However, the elder immediately notices that he is still guarded. Even while acting respectful, Juwon keeps his posture ready, prepared to move at any moment. Realizing this, the elder understands that the man is sharper and more observant than he first appeared. Finally, the hooded elder announces that from that day forward, he will teach Juwon everything he knows and make him into a true hunter. Juwon is left confused by the foreign words. He cannot understand the old man's intentions or why he is so interested in him. The scene shifts to the following morning. Juwon wakes feeling as if dawn has come before he even had time to properly sleep. Inside the cabin, Lizzie and Dorothy are already near the fire, grilling meat and preparing for the day. When Juwon rises and moves toward the door, he notices the hooded elder standing silently outside through the open window. That sight immediately puts him on guard again. Juwon deliberately does not invite the man inside. He does not want a stranger becoming comfortable with entering a house where only Lizzie and Dorothy might be present whenever he is gone. Even as he gets ready, his attention stays on the elder outside. The old man waits with a faint smile, but the expression feels suspicious. To Juan, it resembles the forced smile of manipulative corporate workers from his previous life, the kind of smile used during uncomfortable salary negotiations. Still, he can tell the elder is trying, in his own strange way, to act politely. Behind him, Lizzie softly calls his name. Juan turns toward her and calmly reassures her that he will come back soon. His expression softens when he sees her carefully preparing food for him to take along. The simple act makes her feel like a caring wife, and warmth rises in his chest as he thinks again that she is truly adorable. Nearby, Dorothy watches quietly. The moment she realizes that Juan is about to leave, she hurries toward him, almost as if she wants to stop him from going. At the same time, Lizzie quickly hands him the lunchbox she prepared. She urges him to eat properly while he is away. Her concern is so sincere that it stirs something unfamiliar inside him. For the first time in a long while, Juan feels what it means to have someone waiting for his return. Even after giving him the food, Lizzie keeps watching him anxiously. Then she quietly asks him to return safely. Juan understands that she's expressing her worry and care for him. When she repeats the request, wanting to make sure he understands, he answers with a small, reassuring smile. Dorothy runs over too and tells her father to come home safely as well. Looking at the innocent smiles of both mother and daughter, Juan feels his chest grow warm again. He cannot help thinking about how precious this sudden family has become to him. Even so, the peaceful moment does not last. Juan eventually follows the hooded elder into the mountains. The two walk for a long time through the dense wilderness, moving farther away from the cabin with every step. As the path stretches on, Juan's suspicion deepens. He silently wonders what exactly the old man plans to show him. Eventually, the hooded elder stops at a certain spot and speaks in his usual vague, difficult way. Juan does not understand at first, but when he watches more carefully, he realizes the old man is pointing his attention toward the ground. With his feet, the elder demonstrates something in the dirt beneath them. Juan lowers his gaze and studies the marks. The moment he notices the strange footprints carved into the soil, his expression shifts slightly. The old man then walks ahead into the forest, his body completely covered in thick, heavy clothes. Even from behind, his movements feel strange. Each step carries an unusual weight, as if he is pressing power into the earth itself. Juan watches carefully, unable to look away. To him, the footwork looks extraordinary, almost like some hidden martial technique. It reminds him of something like a 1,000-pound step or an earth-shattering stomp from a martial arts story. Whatever it is, Juan becomes certain of one thing. He wants to learn it. Driven by curiosity, he begins copying the old man's movements. He slowly swings his legs and tries to match each step as closely as possible while following along the mountain path. The elder clearly notices what he is doing, but he says nothing and simply continues walking. From that day onward, the elder begins teaching Juan about the mountains and the life of a hunter. He does not start with weapons or killing techniques. Instead, he teaches Juan how to understand the mountain itself. He leads him through narrow paths, rough slopes, and dense woods, making him touch the bark of different trees and feel the ground beneath his feet. Through this, he teaches that every part of the mountain has its own atmosphere. Some areas feel dry and rough, while others feel damp, cold, and heavy. Each section has its own identity, and the elder wants Juan to memorize all of it. The training grows more demanding as time passes. Again and again, the old man makes Juan focus on the shape and texture of the earth beneath him. Juan feels every stone, every patch of soil, every slope, and every uneven step until the terrain slowly begins to carve itself into his memory. Little by little, he starts to understand how hunters move through the wilderness without hesitation. Later that day, Juan sits on a large rock while the elder stands nearby. The old man calmly opens his bag and takes something out, then gives Juan a signal. The moment Juan sees it, his face brightens. He thinks that at last he can finally eat the lunch Lizzie worked so hard to prepare for him. But just as he opens the lunchbox, the elder immediately stops him. He explains that food made by humans carries a strong scent through the mountains. If Juan opens the lunchbox there, nearby beasts will smell it and gather around them. Juan's excitement collapses at once. Reluctantly, he closes the lunchbox again. Remembering how Lizzie woke early and worked hard to prepare it makes his heart grow heavy, and the sadness almost brings tears to his eyes. As the day continues, the elder eventually brings Juan to his house. Inside, he shows him several strange bows, unlike the ordinary bows Juan knows. Their shapes and structures are unusual, and they look difficult to use. Without wasting time, the old man hands one of them to Juan and instructs him to follow carefully. The instant Juan tries to lift it, he is shocked by how heavy it is. Even holding it properly takes effort. The elder, however, handles the weapon with ease. He draws the string smoothly and releases an arrow straight into the target without missing. Watching that skill fills Juan with determination. Juan quickly tries to shoot as well, while the elder corrects his posture and stance. Juan concentrates hard, trying to absorb every detail. By the time the long day of training ends, he understands something clearly. Becoming a real hunter requires patience, discipline, and constant practice. It is not something he can master in a day. Even so, his motivation does not fade. More than anything, he wants to become someone capable of feeding and protecting his wife and daughter. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, the sky remains bright and clear. Dorothy lies quietly on the bed, mumbling softly to herself. Nearby, Lizzie sits close to the warm fireplace, her beautiful hair glowing gently in the firelight, standing in contrast to Juwon's dark hair. As Lizzie rests, she happily rubs her stomach. The meat has filled her so much that her stomach almost feels swollen, but the fullness makes her feel warm and satisfied. For the first time in a long while, she looks truly comfortable. Dorothy notices the change. Ever since Juwon arrived, Lizzie has been smiling more often. Hearing Lizzie laugh makes Dorothy feel warm inside too. Slowly, Dorothy closes her eyes and quietly hopes that the food in her stomach will digest quickly so she can eat more later. But after a moment, another thought slips into her mind. She begins wondering who Juwon really is. Lizzie told her that Juwon is her husband, but Dorothy understands that neither Lizzie nor Juwon is her real parent. A small fear rises in her chest. Deep down, she worries that they might abandon her someday too, just like her real father did. When she wakes up later, she finds herself alone in the cabin. This realization terrifies her. The uneasy feeling lingers until Dorothy suddenly opens her eyes and checks on the meat again. Seeing that it is still there immediately makes her feel relieved and safe. But that peace does not last. As she wonders where Lizzie went, soon, loud voices and angry arguing come from outside the house. Curious and worried, Dorothy carefully peeks through the window. Outside, Lizzie stands facing three men. The men aggressively accuse her of stealing meat from the village and secretly hiding it from them. Lizzie firmly explains that her husband hunted the meat, but the men refuse to believe her. Instead, they remind her that they helped her find a new husband after she lost her previous one. They accuse her of being selfish and ungrateful. Before long, the situation worsens as they force their way into the house. Terrified by their sudden intrusion, Dorothy quickly crawls under the bed and hides. The men step deeper inside, and their eyes soon land on the large black wolf pelt. The moment they see it, their expressions change with greed and interest. But before any of them can move to take it, Lizzie steps directly in front of them and blocks their path. With firm determination, she declares that they will not be allowed. A blonde-haired man stared at Lizzie with open contempt and mockingly says that she had become bold lately. He sneered that not long ago she would never have dared to speak back to them like this. Caparson shoved her violently and laughed as he says that now that she had a husband, she suddenly believed she could bare her fangs at them. Lizzie crashed hard onto the floor. Trembling, she slowly tried to lift herself back up. As she raised her head, her eyes instinctively drifted beneath the bed where Dorothy was secretly hiding. The moment she noticed Dorothy there, terror flashed across her face. If those men discovered Dorothy hiding underneath the bed, Lizzie could not even imagine what they might do to her. Forcing herself to stay calm, she immediately pretended she had seen nothing. Under the bed, Dorothy covered her mouth with both hands while fear overwhelmed her thoughts. In her mind, she bitterly thought that she had always been hated because she was a bad child who only hid alone instead of helping anyone. Panic consumed her as she wondered what she should do now, yet her body remained frozen in place. Meanwhile, the yellow-haired man continued mocking Lizzie. He ridiculed her expression and sarcastically says that perhaps she suddenly thought life was worth living again after finding herself another husband. Another man quietly laughed and nervously wondered what would happen if the mountain guardian discovered the truth. The yellow-haired man dismissively replies that the guardian could not even understand their language anyway. He casually says that as long as nobody spoke carelessly, nothing would happen. The others continue talking without any concern at all, though one of them warns that getting caught would become troublesome. Another says that mountain guardians were extremely difficult to find, and losing someone like Juwon would create serious problems for everyone. Without hesitation, the yellow-haired man grabbed Lizzie roughly and dragged her toward the door. He declares that they would simply head into the forest instead, then orders the others to gather everything while he takes her away. Lizzie desperately struggled to resist, but before she could protest, the yellow-haired man glared at her coldly and threatens that if she told her husband anything, they would return during the night and burn down the cabin along with everything inside it. After delivering the threat, the group finally left, dragging Lizzie away by force. The cabin became deathly silent. Slowly, Dorothy crawled out from beneath the bed, her entire body trembling uncontrollably. Tears filled her eyes as horrifying thoughts flooded her mind. She realized that Lizzie had been dragged away and became convinced that something terrible was about to happen to her. Her breathing turned uneven as fear tightened painfully around her chest. She desperately wondered what would happen if Lizzie never returned. Dorothy tried to scream, but the instant a sound nearly escaped her lips, she quickly covered her mouth with both hands again. Terrified that the men outside might still hear her, she curled into herself while tears streamed endlessly down her cheeks. Through quiet sobs, she weakly calls out for Juwon and begs him to return quickly. Unable to endure the fear any longer, Dorothy finally broke down completely and cried uncontrollably. At the same time, Juwon was making his way back home while silently thinking that the day had felt unbearably long. Exhaustion covered his face as he walked. Before he could continue further, the old man suddenly called out to him. Juwon respectfully stopped and bowed his head slightly toward him. He sincerely thanked him for everything he had done today. But in that exact moment, Juwon heard something faint in the distance. The instant the sound reached him, his expression completely changed. He immediately recognized the voice. Dorothy was crying. A freezing sensation pierced through his chest as panic instantly overtook him. Juwon hurried forward at terrifying speed while thinking that Dorothy would never cry like that unless something terrible had happened. Fear endlessly repeated itself inside his mind as he worried whether something had happened to Lizzie or Dorothy. The moment Juwon arrived, he saw the man dragging his wife along with their belongings. Rage consumed him, and he did not hesitate even slightly. His fist exploded straight into the red-haired man's face with overwhelming force, instantly knocking him unconscious. Everyone nearby froze in complete shock the instant they witnessed it happen. Juwon immediately rushed toward another man wearing wolf-hide clothing and crushed him with a brutal knee strike that instantly dropped him to the ground as well. Then his eyes locked onto the yellow-haired man. Juwon grabbed him tightly around the waist and violently slammed him backward onto the earth. Before the man could even recover, Juwon began beating him mercilessly. Every punch carried terrifying force as uncontrollable rage poured out of him. Inside his mind, dark thoughts consumed him. He bitterly realized that human nature was filthy and cruel, and once people started looking down on someone, everything was already over. After some time, Juwon slowly stood back up. A cold and suffocating aura poured from his body so heavily that everyone nearby could feel it. His eyes burned with fury as he decided that he needed to carve fear deeply into these people's hearts. He wanted them to understand that if they ever attempted something like this again, the consequences would become far worse than today. Suddenly, a sound came from behind him. The instant Juwon turned his head, the yellow-haired man seized the opportunity and lunged at him with a weapon. However, Juwon instantly caught him before the attack could even land. This time, though, it no longer looked as if Juwon intended to spare him. The rage inside him had already crossed into something far more dangerous. The pressure surrounding him grew heavier as he restrained the man in place, and just as the situation was about to spiral completely out of control, the old man finally arrived and loudly shouts for Juwon to calm himself down. The old man firmly tells him to look carefully and asks whether he could not see how terrified his daughter was. Hearing those words, Juwon immediately turned toward the cabin. Standing near the doorway was Dorothy, crying uncontrollably while trembling in fear. The moment Juwon saw her fragile figure, all the fury inside him instantly disappeared. The terrifying pressure surrounding him faded away, and his expression slowly softened. Lizzie silently watched him from the side while her heart pounded rapidly. Until now, she had believed Juwon was someone gentle who did not even know how to become angry. Yet seeing him like this made her realize he could become frighteningly furious when pushed too far. Her gaze slowly drifted toward the men lying beaten on the ground. For a brief moment, while watching Juwon mercilessly beat them, he reminded her of her late husband. Fear briefly passed through her body as she wondered if she herself might one day end up lying on the ground just like those men, but the instant she looked into Juwon's eyes again, that fear completely disappeared. Those eyes were not trying to frighten her at all. What she saw instead were the desperate eyes of someone trying to protect her. Quietly, Lizzie realized that Juwon probably believed she was afraid of him. Juwon slowly approached her and softly calls her name. At the same time, Lizzie lowered her gaze as countless emotions swirled inside her chest. Bitterly, she questioned why the feelings of a worthless woman like herself mattered so much to him. Looking down at her own trembling body, she realized there should no longer be anything left in this world for her to fear. Yet despite that, her body continued shaking uncontrollably. Her chest tightened painfully as she stared at Juwon's wounded expression. In her heart, she desperately wished he would stop looking so hurt. She wanted to tell him clearly that she was not afraid of him at all. The words themselves would have been easy to say, but they could not understand each other's language. Slowly, Lizzie reached out her trembling hand. Softly calling Juwon's name, she gently placed her hand against his. The warmth from his touch spread through her entire body instantly. Along with it, every trace of fear quietly melted away. For the first time in an incredibly long while, she truly felt safe. It felt as though nothing terrible could ever happen to her as long as she remained beside him. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him, and with a trembling voice overflowing with emotion, she thanked him sincerely. Afterward, Juwon quietly looked down at Lizzie, who was still tightly holding onto his hand. In a soft voice, he gently calls her name. At that moment, he became overwhelmed by emotion and could no longer suppress his feelings. Without another word, he stepped closer and wrapped his arms tightly around her in a heartfelt embrace. She looked slightly surprised by his sudden action, but after a moment, she gently returned the hug and softly thanked him as well. Not far away, Dorothy silently watched the scene unfold. Yet unlike the emotional warmth between Juwon and Lizzie, Dorothy still looked utterly terrified. Her face had gone pale, and her body trembled faintly as if she were still trapped within a nightmare. Lizzie soon noticed Dorothy standing there and immediately pointed toward her while worriedly calling out her name. The moment she saw Dorothy's condition, Lizzie hurried toward her without hesitation. Meanwhile, Juwon chose to remain outside instead of following after them. He quietly decided it would be better to give the two girls space rather than interfere. When Lizzie finally reached Dorothy, she looked at her with deep concern and gently asks whether she was all right. But the closer she came, the more she realized Dorothy's entire body was shaking uncontrollably. Dorothy herself could barely calm her thoughts. Inside her mind, horrifying memories endlessly repeated themselves. She thought about how she had been the one who asked Juwan for help, yet seeing his massive fists swinging violently right in front of her had terrified her deeply. The horrifying images refused to leave her head. Again and again she remembered the swollen, beaten faces of her stepmother and Lizzie after suffering brutal violence in the past. The bruises on their faces had been horrifying mixtures of red, blue, and yellow. The more Dorothy remembered those swollen faces, the more fear tightened around her heart. She could not stop imagining that one day her own face might become just like theirs. That thought alone left her feeling utterly powerless. Before long, tears slowly rolled down Dorothy's cheeks, yet even while crying, another painful memory surfaced inside her mind. She remembered the cruel words that had once been forced into her heart, words warning that crying would only lead to even harsher beatings. Those memories had scarred her so deeply that even now she feared showing weakness. Fighting to control her trembling emotions, Dorothy shakily says through her tears that she needed to apologize to Lizzie immediately. She believed she had done something terrible and feared it would already be too late. With fear filling her voice, she admits that she was terrified Lizzie might begin treating her like a ghost, exactly the same way her stepmother once had. Then, still trembling badly, Dorothy slowly reached her hand toward Lizzie and weakly apologized. She says that she was sorry for hiding instead of helping and begged Lizzie not to abandon her alone. The guilt buried inside her heart finally spilled out completely. Dorothy truly believed she had abandoned Lizzie when she needed her most, and the fear of being left behind again frightened her more than anything else in the world. The moment Lizzie heard those words, she immediately pulled Dorothy into a warm embrace without even hesitating. Holding her tightly, Lizzie gently explains that when their eyes met earlier, she had only pretended not to notice Dorothy because she was afraid the men would discover her hiding place. Her voice remained soft and comforting, filled with genuine affection. Lizzie desperately wanted Dorothy to understand that none of this had been her fault. She continued reassuring her, gently insisting that Dorothy had absolutely nothing to feel guilty about. Hearing those words, Dorothy slowly lifted her tearful eyes and quietly asks if that was really true. Her voice carried disbelief, as though kindness itself felt unfamiliar to her. Lizzie smiled warmly before gently asking whether Dorothy had been frightened earlier. Then she softly reassures her that everything was all right now because Papa was there. The instant Dorothy heard that word, confusion immediately spread across her face. She quietly repeats the word Papa in disbelief before saying that her father had already died. To Dorothy, the idea made no sense at all. Her real father was gone, so hearing someone suddenly call another person Papa left her unable to understand. Lizzie then softly asks whether Dorothy truly did not know who Juwan was. Dorothy repeated his name uncertainly before replying that Juwan was Lizzie's husband and says that she already knew that much. Lizzie nodded with a smile and gently explains that since Juwan was her husband, that naturally made him Dorothy's papa as well. Dorothy's eyes widened instantly after hearing that. She quietly mutters the word papa again, this time far more softly, as though she was desperately trying to understand its meaning. Lizzie continued speaking gently. She reminds Dorothy that she herself was Dorothy's stepmother. Dorothy slowly nodded in response. Seeing that, Lizzie smiles and explains that since Dorothy was her daughter, Juwan naturally became Dorothy's papa too. Dorothy could hardly process what she was hearing. Slowly, she turned toward the outside and stared at Juwan standing in the distance. Looking at him blankly, she whispers in disbelief that he was her father. Lizzie immediately answered with confidence. She firmly explains that Juwan was completely different from Dorothy's old father. He was not someone who hurt them, but someone who protected them instead. Her words carried a warmth Dorothy had never experienced before. For perhaps the very first time in her life, the word father no longer sounded frightening. Dorothy looked back toward Juwan once more while struggling to process everything. Then, with innocent confusion still trembling in her voice, she quietly asks whether Juwan had beaten those terrifying men so brutally because he was Dorothy's papa and because she had asked him for help. She repeated those thoughts to herself in disbelief. After saying that, Dorothy slowly looked out the window again toward Juwan. A strange warmth quietly spread through her chest, a feeling she had never truly experienced before. Almost unconsciously, she began softly repeating the word Papa over and over in a small but excited voice. Inside her mind, countless thoughts flooded endlessly together. She excitedly thought about how someone with such a huge face, enormous body, and giant hands and feet was actually her papa. To Dorothy, he felt like an incredibly strong and amazing father who protected both her and Lizzie. Since she was still inside the cabin, Juwan could not hear her calling him. Unable to contain her emotions any longer, Dorothy suddenly rushed outside toward him. As she ran closer, more thoughts flooded her mind one after another. She thought about how he never beat her, how he held her close at night while they slept together, how he smiled at her, gave her meat, and even gifted her a name. To Dorothy, those simple acts of kindness felt more precious than anything else in existence. Her heart trembled with happiness as she realized something unbelievable. The person who had given her a name was her papa. To her, that felt wonderfully precious. Still repeatedly calling out Papa in excitement, Dorothy unknowingly ran closer and closer until she finally reached Juwon. At that moment, Juwon turned around and noticed her. The instant he saw Dorothy staring at him with sparkling eyes while happily calling him Papa, his entire expression softened. Without hesitation, he immediately scooped her into his arms. Even though he could not fully understand the exact words she was shouting, somewhere deep inside, he instinctively understood the feelings behind them. Quietly, Juwon thought to himself that Dorothy kept repeating words he did not know, yet somehow he still felt as though he understood their meaning perfectly. Holding her carefully, Juwon gently patted Dorothy's head affectionately. But after a few moments, his expression suddenly shifted slightly as he noticed something strange. He paused briefly before realizing the truth. Dorothy had wet herself. Even after noticing it, Juwon could only smile helplessly. Dorothy looked so innocent and overwhelmingly happy that he almost felt guilty for even thinking about it. Still, he quickly reminded himself that her clothes needed to be changed immediately before she caught a cold. At that same moment, Lizzie finally came running outside as well. The instant she arrived, Juwon naturally pulled her into the embrace too, holding both Dorothy and Lizzie together inside his large arms. For the first time, the scene truly resembled a real family. However, while being held there, Dorothy suddenly noticed something behind them and immediately shouted about the meat. Her eyes sparkled with excitement the instant she saw it. Without wasting a second, she hurried off so suddenly that both Juwon and Lizzie looked confused by her reaction. They watched in surprise as Dorothy rushed toward the unconscious men lying nearby before stopping in front of a basket close to them. Despite being such a tiny child, Dorothy immediately tried lifting the heavy basket with all her strength. Naturally, it was far too heavy for someone her size, and at first it did not move at all. Even so, Dorothy stubbornly refused to give up. Gritting her teeth, she continued pouring every ounce of strength she had into lifting it. Watching her struggle so seriously, both Juwon and Lizzie hurried toward her to help. But before they could even reach her, Dorothy somehow managed to slowly lift the basket little by little on her own. Seeing that unbelievable sight, Juwon could only stare blankly before quietly muttering in disbelief that her obsession with meat was truly terrifying. Seeing Dorothy struggle so desperately, Juwon finally stepped forward to help her. Dorothy immediately turned around the moment she sensed him beside her. The instant she saw her father helping, her eyes sparkled brightly with admiration again. Juwon easily grabbed the basket and helped carry it together with her. Watching the child look at him with such overwhelming admiration over something as simple as carrying a basket full of meat made Juwon feel strangely amused inside. Quietly, he thought to himself that earning the admiration of a child over a single basket of meat made becoming a hero seem remarkably easy. At the same time, Lizzie called out from nearby and tells them to bring both the meat and Dorothy back inside since remaining outside was dangerous. Hearing her words, Juwon calmly nodded. Soon afterward, the three of them returned inside together while carrying the basket. Compared to the terrifying chaos outside, the atmosphere within the cabin felt far warmer and safer. After taking care of everything inside, Juwon eventually stepped back outside alone. The instant he returned outdoors, the warmth in his expression vanished completely, replaced once more by intense anger burning deep inside him. He still had no intention of forgiving the three men lying there. Deep in his heart, Juwon wanted to finish them off completely so they could never threaten his family again. However, before he could act on those violent thoughts, the old man suddenly stepped forward and firmly warns him not to beat or kill anyone anymore. Hearing that, Juwon coldly asks whether the old man was truly telling him not to kill them. Even while speaking, Juwon forced himself to think rationally. He realized that getting arrested or turned into a slave again would become a serious problem now. That single thought alone forced him to calm down slightly. Things were no longer the same anymore. He could not live only for himself now. Juwon glared furiously at the defeated men and muttered through clenched teeth at the bastards lying before him. Yet inside his mind, his thoughts became even darker. He silently vowed that because he was no longer alone, he would remember every one of their faces perfectly. If they ever crossed paths again, he promised himself they would suffer a fate far worse than death. The killing intent inside him had not disappeared in the slightest. He was merely forcing himself to suppress it. After calming himself somewhat, Juwon glanced around and noticed the scattered supplies lying outside. Quietly, he thought that he should at least take those supplies back with him. Living in the mountains required complete self-sufficiency, and wasting useful resources would only make survival more difficult later. At that moment, Juwon glanced back through the doorway toward the inside of the cabin. There, he saw Lizzie and Dorothy together, both looking genuinely safe and happy. That sight instantly softened his expression. For a brief moment, all the rage inside him quietly faded away. Without another word, Juwon gathered the remaining supplies outside and carried them back into the house. As he walked toward the room where his wife and daughter were waiting for him, a powerful thought echoed deeply inside his heart. Losing a family once had already been more than enough. His eyes slowly hardened with determination as he silently vowed that no matter what happened, he would protect those two at all costs. Juwon gently held Lizzie's face in his hands and looked closely at the bruise on her cheek. Seeing the mark still there made frustration rise inside him, and he thinks that if he could activate magic, he would be able to erase a bruise like that in an instant. Lizzie noticed his worried expression and quickly says that she was okay. Then she reached up with both hands and cupped his face instead, trying to reassure him with a bright smile. When she squeezed his cheeks, she could not hold back a small laugh. Juan stayed silent, his face awkwardly squished between her hands. A moment later, he suddenly lifted Lizzie into his arms. Lizzie looked startled as he held her in a careful bridal carry. Juan calmly thinks that the floor was freezing, as if that alone was reason enough to pick her up. Lizzie stared up at him in surprise while he held her close. Then Juan suddenly froze. His eyes widened as he looked at her face more carefully. The bruise that had been there only moments ago was completely gone. Juan stared at her in disbelief and wondered if the magic practice from earlier had actually worked. Then his expression brightened with sudden excitement as he realizes that he could finally use healing magic. Lizzie simply looked at him in confusion, unable to understand why he had become so happy. Meanwhile, in the village chief's wife angrily exclaimed that the feather-brained fool must have gone completely mad. A chicken rushed around near her feet, pecking and flapping wildly, and she complained that it did not even recognize its own master and kept sticking its beak into everything. The village chief stood nearby with his arms crossed and asks whether she was truly that upset just because he had given some cloth to the mountain guardian. He said that she still did not understand, and he asks how many times he had to spell it out before she realized they needed that mountain guardian. She snapped angrily, saying that even if that was true, he did not need to hand over fabric on top of everything else. She complained that she had spent 10 years secretly saving that fabric. The village chief says that he knew, but there had been no other choice. He explains that the mountain guardian carried the aura of someone who had seen real fights. He adds that if more people ended up injured or dead, this year's harvest would be ruined completely. He calls her short-sighted and says that she never thinks beyond what is directly in front of her. She asks how grand his plan could possibly be for him to give away her fabric as if it meant nothing. The village chief quietly thinks that he had seen it clearly yesterday. When Juan first arrived, there had been no animal bite marks on him, but later he had wounds that were healing at an absurd speed. Because of that, the chief concludes that Gus had been right. He realizes that the mountain guardian is a mage, and not only that, but a healing mage. The thought makes the village chief grow serious. He thinks that he must move very carefully from now on, because even nobles would fight over a mage that powerful. If Juan was valuable enough for royalty to want him, then the chief could sell him for an enormous sum. A dark smile spread across his face as he imagines that, if everything went according to plan, he would rise far above the position of a simple village chief. For now, no one knew that a healing mage was living in the village. The villagers were ignorant, so they would never notice. But if rumors began spreading and some noble or guild discovered Juan before the chief could profit from him, then everything would be over. The village chief thinks that the only person he could rely on was old Gus. While Gus watched over the mountain guardian, the chief only needed to find a noble interested in employing a healing mage. Turning back to his wife, the village chief tells her that, in the meantime, she should try to get on good terms with the mountain guardian's wife. He explains that Gus had said the mountain guardian picked up hunting incredibly fast and had excellent instincts. Compared to the other people they had seen before, Juan was in a completely different league. The chief warns that if they made a mistake, Juan might realize they had been secretly taking the Lord's goods and could turn them in. He also mentions that Juan was apparently very attached to his new wife, so if his wife became close with Lizzie, they might be able to buy rabbit pelts at a bargain. Hearing that, the village chief's wife finally agrees. As she turns away, she says that there were things women needed to handle together. After she leaves, the village chief stands alone and thinks that they should also return some of the things they had taken from the mountain guardian's cabin. He realizes Juan is nothing like the random people they had dragged there before. If they did not act now, the matter would eventually explode in their faces. With a cold expression, he tosses wood into the fire and thinks that it was unfortunate, but there was no helping it. As the flames rose high around him, he smiles darkly and thinks that sometimes a little meat had to be sacrificed to reach the bone. A few days passed. At the mountain cabin, cheerful humming drifted through the air. Juan adjusted his black clothes and quietly thinks that Lizzie seemed to be in good spirits again today. He then recalls that the village chief must have decided one piece of fabric was not enough, because even more goods had been sent over that morning. Inside the room, Lizzie sat happily with cloth and small containers spread around her. She held the fabric with a bright smile, clearly delighted by the unexpected gifts. Juan watched her and wondered if getting back a few old items and some ingredients was really enough to make her this happy. He thinks that she had not even looked half this excited when the bruise on her face disappeared right before her eyes. As he continued watching Lizzie, he was reminded once again that real happiness often hid in small, simple things. That was one of the reasons he loved her. He looked at her with warmth and thinks that a woman like that was his wife. Then Juan stepped closer and tells Lizzie that he was heading out. Lizzie looked up in surprise and repeats the words as if she was trying to understand the phrase. She smiled gently and taught him again, saying that he was leaving now. His face lit up as he copied her. With a cheerful smile, Lizzie stood in the doorway and waved at Juwan as she tells him to come back safely. Juwan looked back at her, waved in return, and then remembered that Gus had said he was going rabbit hunting that day. As he walked away, Juwan wondered whether they would actually manage to catch any rabbits. He thought that it would be nice, especially for Dorothy since she was always begging for meat. He sincerely hoped they could bring back a rabbit. But the moment that thought settled in, another followed. Holding the cleaver, he wondered whether he would really be able to kill one if a rabbit actually appeared. He immediately scolded himself and thinks that if he was going to survive there as a hunter, he had to let go of his modern way of thinking. Even so, he could not help hesitating. Whenever he imagined a small, round, fluffy white rabbit, his mind kept drifting to his rabbit-like wife instead, and he wondered how he was supposed to kill it after thinking that way. Because of that, he could only hope that if they really did catch one, it would be ugly. Later, after finishing his chores, Juwan wiped his forehead and let out a tired breath. He thought that he had already fetched the water and split all the firewood, yet he still had plenty of time left. Since he had spare time, he decided he might as well use it to practice magic. He looked at his hands and thinks that since the day before, healing cuts and minor wounds had already become second nature to him. Even so, he still could not produce even the tiniest flame. He wondered how he had managed to do it that one time and questioned whether it had only happened because he had been in a life-or-death situation. After thinking for a while, he considers that maybe it would work if he imagined something flowing through his core. With that idea in mind, he stretched out his hand and boldly tried to cast fire magic, even shouting that it was a firestorm. Nothing happened. Even after failing, he calmly thinks that he was not that disappointed, since he had not been expecting much from the start. Still, he felt a little regretful. He thinks that Dorothy would be so excited if he could really produce fire. Healing magic did not create any flashy sounds or lights, so Dorothy had not seemed impressed by it at all. He had really wanted to show her fire magic, and he quietly laments what a shame that was. Just as he lowered his hand, something suddenly flickered at his fingertips. Juwan stared at it in shock and exclaims in surprise. A tiny flame had finally appeared. He immediately realizes that he had succeeded with fire magic, though he also admits that it looked more like a lighter flame than anything impressive. At that moment, Dorothy appeared nearby, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She looked toward him without much thought at first, but the moment she noticed the flame dancing on his finger, her eyes flew wide open. Pointing at him in amazement, Dorothy excitedly exclaimed that Papa was shooting fire out of his finger. Juwan quickly warned her not to come too close and told her to be careful in case the fire was hot. But Dorothy was far too excited to listen. She declares that she had to go tell Mama that Papa could use fire magic. She ran off in delight while still staring at the flame in wonder. Lizzie soon came out after hearing Dorothy call for her. She called Dorothy's name, then stopped when she noticed Juwan's hand. Shock spread across her face as she stared at the flame. Dorothy eagerly repeated that Papa could use fire magic, while Lizzie looked at Juwan's hand in disbelief and exclaims that fire was really coming out of his hand. Juwan watched their excited reactions and quietly thinks that he had wanted to conjure a much bigger flame since they seemed so thrilled, but no matter what he did, it simply would not grow any larger. Still, he comforted himself by thinking that at least he could now use two types of magic. He also hoped that someday he would be able to summon a proper, elegant flame. Just then, Lizzie suddenly let out a small cry, as if something had occurred to her. She quickly turned and hurried away. Watching her, Juwan asked in confusion whether she had already seen something. But Lizzie was already moving, and Juwan could only stand there with the little flame still burning on his finger, wondering what had gotten into her. As he looked at the weak little spark, he could only think with faint frustration that he had worked so hard just to make that tiny flame appear. Juwan stared at the small flame on his finger and wondered how he was supposed to put it out. After hesitating for a moment, he decided to give up and thought that he would simply leave it alone and let it die out on its own. The instant he thought that, the flame vanished. Startled, Juwan reacted in confusion, then quietly reflected that magic in this world was truly strange. He admits to himself that he did not understand at all how it actually worked. Soon after, he stepped back inside and called out for Dorothy. He found her pushing against the meat barrel. Dorothy looked back at him and sadly says that there was less meat than before. Nearby, Lizzie smiled awkwardly, and Juwan immediately understood that Dorothy was upset because the amount of meat had decreased. Seeing her sulking, Juwan firmly says that Papa would bring her rabbit meat that day. At that moment, a voice from outside asked whether Juwan was ready. He turned in surprise and saw that Gus had already arrived. Realizing that the old man was already waiting, Juwan quickly prepared to leave. As he adjusted his things, he says that he was heading out. Dorothy immediately ran closer and tells him to be careful on his way. Juwan softly replies that he would, then patted her head and praised her as a good girl. Hearing that, Dorothy delightedly boasts that she really was a good girl. Lizzie then quietly tells him to take care. Juwan looked at her and says that Lizzie should be careful too. After saying that, he leaned down and kissed her before leaving. Watching that, Dorothy puffed up and says that she wanted one too. Juwan immediately crouched down and says that there would be a kiss for Dorothy as well. He kissed her affectionately, and Dorothy laughed happily in his arms. But as soon as he pulled back, he noticed the smell on her breath and points out that it smelled like meat. He teasingly says that she must have been sneaking bites, and Dorothy let out a flustered cry. After leaving the house, Juwan and Gus headed straight for the traps Gus had set. On the way there, Gus continued teaching him the whole time. He pointed out trees along the path and showed him which ones would produce good timber if properly pruned. At other times, they stopped so Gus could make him study rabbit droppings. Then, while walking through the forest, Gus suddenly told him to stop. Juwan halted at once. Gus pointed ahead and tells him to look over there. Juwan followed his finger and widened his eyes in surprise. Standing there was a rabbit. At least, Gus called it a rabbit. Juwan stared at the creature in disbelief and thought that it looked nothing like any rabbit he had ever seen. The beast stood upright with a heavy body and powerful legs, and to him it looked less like a normal rabbit and more like a rabbit that had somehow evolved into a kangaroo. Even so, Gus calmly identifies it as a rabbit, leaving Juwan speechless as he tried to process the absurd sight before him. The rabbit-like beast suddenly roared and charged forward with glowing eyes and bared fangs. Juwan judged from the energy it still had that it could not have been trapped for very long. Gus calmly stood near the trees, watching the beast's movements, and Juwan realized that this made it the perfect prey. However, Gus also made it clear that hunting it would not be easy. He explains that hunting a wild beast charging straight at someone was nothing like hunting an animal that could not fight back. As Gus watched the creature, he says that the feeling of a first hunt never fades, no matter how old someone becomes. Then he tells Juwan to pull out the arrow he had given him. Juwan reached back and drew an arrow from the quiver. Gus silently observed him and thought that Juwan really was sharp. It had only been a short time since he began training in the mountains, yet he was already picking up words and piecing them together. Gus then says that he was giving Juwan the first kill. He adds that he wanted Juwan to understand just how dangerous hunting truly was, and that he would never forget what he experienced that day. The rabbit prowled ahead, still tense and ready to attack. Gus ordered Juwan to move closer, then told him to aim for the legs first. Juwan repeated the order in confusion, wondering why Gus wanted him to shoot the legs. This was training on live prey. First came an animal that was calm and helpless. Second came a target screaming in pain. The mountain was impartial. It did not side with humans. If someone committed a cruel act, the wild beast would eventually make that person pay for it. Gus warns Juwan to never forget what he went through that day if he wanted to return alive from a hunt. Juwan drew the bow with a serious expression and thought about shooting the rabbit in the leg. He knew it would not die from that and would only suffer instead. He did not understand why Gus was telling him to do such a thing. Gus firmly orders him to shoot now, telling him to hit the legs first, then the head. The rabbit glared at them and growled. For some reason, Juwan suddenly found himself thinking back to the very first day he woke up in that world. He remembered skin and bones. He remembered a corpse abandoned as if it had simply been left to rot. He remembered a cramped, miserable place where people were stripped of their humanity. Back then, Juwan had known almost nothing about mountains or hunting. The rabbit suddenly charged at full speed. Juwan realized that, of course, he had also known just as little about living in that world. But one thing was certain. Gus was doing everything he could to shape him into a proper hunter. With that thought burning inside him, Juwan steadied his aim and released the arrow. The arrow tore through the air toward the charging rabbit. Juwan's arrow struck the rabbit's leg. The small creature tumbled across the forest floor, twisting and kicking wildly as agonized cries echoed through the peaceful woods. The painful sight made Juwan freeze. Beside him, old Gus stood with his arms folded, his expression calm and unreadable. He tells Juwan to shoot it again. Juwan looks back at the wounded rabbit and asks if Gus truly expects him to fire a second arrow. Without hesitation, Gus says that he does. This time, he instructs him to aim for the rabbit's front paw. Juwan's eyes widen. The animal is already suffering. One well-placed arrow could kill it instantly and end its pain, yet Gus is ordering him to wound it again. However, the old hunter's unwavering gaze makes it clear that this lesson is important. Slowly, Juwan turns back toward the rabbit. It continues dragging itself across the ground while crying in pain, and sympathy begins rising inside him. He tells himself that he cannot hesitate. If he keeps watching the creature suffer, he will only feel more sorry for it. Clenching his jaw, he reminds himself not to think about the rabbit. He must think about Dorothy and Lizzie instead. Everything he is doing is for them. Reluctantly, Juwan raises his bow again. The rabbit's cries reach him, but he forces himself to ignore them. He tells himself that it is merely the sound of an animal and nothing more. Taking a deep breath, he pulls back the bowstring. The forest seems to fall silent. For one brief moment, the rabbit becomes the only thing in his world. Then he releases the arrow. Time appears to slow as the terrified rabbit sees the projectile speeding toward it. Juwan tells himself that it does not matter if he becomes a villain. The arrow continues forward. He tells himself that it does not matter if he becomes a demon. A heartbeat later, the arrow strikes its target. The lesson is over. Sometime later, the afternoon sun begins descending toward the horizon. Juwan and Gus sit together in silence. Neither speaks for a long while as Juwan stares at the ground, unable to stop thinking about what he did. Eventually, he says that he could have killed the rabbit instantly. After a brief pause, he admits that he deliberately caused it more pain instead. The confession weighs heavily on him. He hates admitting it, but he cannot deny the truth. He continues by saying that such an act feels cruel and unnatural. His fists tighten as he adds that hunting is not a noble or romantic pursuit. It is ultimately a struggle for survival between humans and animals. Lowering his gaze to his hands, he reflects that those same hands provide food for his family while also inflicting suffering upon helpless creatures. After another long silence, he softly says that he must never forget what happened today. If he forgets, he might begin treating life carelessly. He might also lose sight of the true meaning of hunting. Gus suddenly rises without saying anything. He grabs a large sack and tosses it toward Juwan. Juwan catches it instinctively and is immediately surprised by the weight. Curious, he opens the bag and finds several rabbits packed inside. His eyes widen as he asks if all of them are truly for him. Gus smiles and tells him to take them. For a moment, Juwan is speechless. That much meat could feed his family for quite some time. Gratitude fills his chest, and he sincerely thanks Gus. The old hunter dismisses it with a casual wave, saying that it is nothing worth mentioning. Then his expression changes. He says that one final rabbit remains. Juwan looks around in confusion and asks where it is. Gus points toward a nearby patch of grass and says that it is over there. Following his finger, Juwan spots a lone rabbit standing in the distance. Juwan carefully sets the sack down and reaches for his bow, but before drawing it, a different thought enters his mind. Why do they need to kill it? As he studies the animal, another possibility forms. They could raise it instead. The longer he considers the idea, the more practical it seems. Rabbits are relatively easy to care for, reproduce quickly, and could eventually become a dependable source of food. If hunting ever became impossible, they could also serve as emergency provisions. Once the idea feels right, Juwan turns toward Gus and says that he does not want to kill this rabbit. Gus raises an eyebrow. Juwan explains that he wants to keep it alive. For the first time, genuine surprise crosses the old hunter's face. Then he chuckles and says that the decision is entirely Juwan's. A faint smile appears on Juwan's face. Gus searches through his belongings and produces another sack. He explains that if Juwan plans to keep the rabbit alive, he must first catch it. Handing him the bag, Gus tells him to use it. Juwan accepts it and thanks him before lowering himself into a crouch. The hunt has transformed into something completely different. Instead of preparing to kill, Juwan is preparing to capture. A short while later, Juwan is back home. The room is quiet and peaceful. As he looks around, memories of his previous life begin resurfacing. He reflects that he never imagined he would have a family one day. In his former world, his life often felt lonely, empty, and directionless. Now everything has changed. He thinks about Dorothy and then about Lizzie. A small smile spreads across his face as he tells himself that he finally has the family he always longed for. Because of them, he has a purpose. He has a reason to live and a reason to work. As his gaze moves around the room, it eventually settles on something hanging near an iron cauldron. It is a wooden sign with symbols carved into its surface. They are not meaningless scratches. They are words written in the language of this world. Juwan's heartbeat quickens. Without wasting time, he grabs the sign and hurries toward Gus. Holding it up, he awkwardly explains that he wants Gus to teach him. The old hunter looks at him curiously. Juwan clarifies that he wants to learn. Gus blinks before asking if he wishes to learn how to read. Juwan eagerly nods and says that he does. For a moment, Gus remains silent. Then he turns around and searches through a pile of old belongings. Eventually, he returns with several items. He explains that the wooden sign will not be enough and that Juwan will also need those learning materials. After placing everything on the table, he hands them over. Juwan's eyes light up as he thanks him. Gus tells him to sit down, and Juwan obeys immediately. Before long, he is practicing letters on sheets of paper while Gus watches nearby. Observing the younger man, Gus thinks that Juwan is truly strange. He wonders what purpose reading could possibly serve him. Then, an old memory resurfaces. Gus reflects that he never expected to still possess those materials. He had bought them long ago when he dreamed of earning military achievements and entering the service of a noble household. That dream never became reality. A bitter smile appears on his face. It took him years to learn how to read. If he had known how his life would ultimately turn out, he doubts he would have bothered learning at all. The thought lingers briefly before he shakes his head. There is no point dwelling on the past. Soon his attention turns toward a more troubling matter: goblins. The mountains have been unusually quiet lately, and that silence worries him. He decides that it is time to begin scouting again. The creatures must have a hidden settlement somewhere deep within the mountains, which means he will need to venture farther than ever before. His expression hardens. Every veteran hunter understands what spring brings. Animals become more active. So do goblins. Just as wildlife enters mating season during spring, goblin activity also increases significantly. Gus looks toward Juwan, who remains completely focused on practicing his letters. He notes that, although Juwan lacks experience, he learns at an astonishing speed. If partnered with seasoned adventurers, he believes the younger man could easily hold his own. Then Gus glances down at his injured leg. A familiar ache throbs through it. Recently, the pains become much worse. He knows exactly what that means. A shadow settles over his face as he thinks that his remaining time is growing short. His eyes narrow. He vows that he will find those cursed goblins. Clenching his fist, he swears that once he discovers them, he will slaughter every single one. The scene shifts to Juwan's cabin. Inside, Lizzie sits quietly sewing a dress while Dorothy watches nearby with obvious impatience. Dorothy asks whether the dress belongs to her. Before Lizzie can properly answer, she immediately asks when it will be finished. Lizzie releases a weary sigh and asks if Dorothy remembers how many times she has already repeated that question. Dorothy tilts her head innocently and says that she does not. A soft laugh escapes Lizzie. Before she can continue, approaching footsteps sound outside the house. Moments later, the door opens. Juwon announces that he has returned home. Dorothy instantly leaps to her feet. Excitement fills her face as she repeatedly calls for her father and races across the room, throwing herself into his arms. Juwon catches her effortlessly. Dorothy proudly tells him to look at her new dress. Juwon studies it and says that it looks wonderful. As he speaks, he lowers a large sack from his shoulder and places it on the floor. Suddenly, Dorothy notices something strange. The sack moves. Her eyes widen as she points toward it and asks why it is moving. Juwon remains calm and says nothing at first. Dorothy gasps before excitedly asking if it is some kind of magical bag. Juwon shakes his head and says that it is not. While holding Dorothy with one arm, he drags the sack closer with the other. Dorothy giggles and says that her father is incredibly strong. Lizzie nods in agreement and says that Dorothy is right. Curiosity soon overwhelms her. She walks over and unties the sack. The moment the opening loosens, something bursts out. Lizzie stumbles backward in shock and falls onto the floor as a rabbit pokes its head out. Everyone freezes. Dorothy stares at the animal in amazement. The rabbit already looks unusual, but then she notices something even stranger. Pointing at it, she tells her father that the rabbit looks weird. Juwon follows her gaze. Dorothy excitedly exclaims that it has horns. The horned rabbit remains still while Dorothy watches it with sparkling eyes. She immediately declares that it is adorable. Lizzie quickly steps forward and warns her not to approach. Confused, Dorothy asks why. Pointing at the rabbit, Lizzie explains that anything with horns could be dangerous. Despite her warning, Lizzie cautiously approaches the creature herself and confidently says that she will catch it. Dorothy watches excitedly and expresses her amazement. Lizzie slowly closes her eyes and reaches forward. Then she opens them. The rabbit is already sitting in her hands. She stares down at it in confusion and wonders if she truly caught it. Something feels wrong. A rabbit should never allow itself to be captured so easily. At that moment, the animal begins trembling violently. Lizzie immediately realizes there is a problem. Looking closer, she notices wounds covering its body. The creature is not trembling because it is aggressive. It is trembling because it is injured. Dorothy's expression changes at once. She asks whether the bunny is hurt. After a brief pause, worry fills her face as she anxiously asks what they should do. Turning toward Juwon, she asks if the rabbit is truly injured. Slightly surprised by her sudden concern, Juwon asks to examine it. He holds out his hands and requests that Lizzie pass the animal to him. Lizzie carefully gives him the rabbit. Juwon cradles it gently and begins inspecting its wounds. After confirming the injuries, he raises one hand. A faint glow gathers around his palm. Lizzie watches curiously as he begins casting healing magic. Warm light flows into the rabbit's body. Gradually, its wounds close. The cuts disappear. Its trembling stops. Within moments, the rabbit looks completely healthy. Dorothy's eyes widen in amazement as she happily announces that the bunny is no longer hurt. Looking at Juwon with admiration, she says that he is amazing before quickly adding that he is truly incredible. Dorothy immediately wraps her arms around him. Receiving praise and affection from both of them fills Juwon with happiness. A faint blush appears on his face as he enjoys the warmth of his family. Eventually, he bends down to place the rabbit on the floor. Before he can do so, Dorothy suddenly asks him to wait. She rushes away and quickly returns carrying a small basket. Holding it proudly, she tells him to place the bunny inside. Without hesitation, Juwon gently lowers the rabbit into the basket. Dorothy kneels beside it with a bright smile and announces that she will take good care of it. Patting the basket softly, she promises to protect the bunny and look after it properly. Juwon and Lizzie exchange glances. Warm smiles spread across their faces. Night gradually falls. Dorothy sleeps beside her bed while hugging the rabbit's basket. Meanwhile, Juwon and Lizzie sit together studying. Lizzie patiently helps him practice reading and writing so he can learn the language of this world. As he studies, Juwon reflects on everything he has gained. He thinks that humans are truly greedy creatures. He already has countless reasons to be grateful, yet he still finds himself wanting more. At first, he was merely thankful to escape the carriage where he had been treated like livestock. Later, he gained a home. Once he had a home, he expanded it to give Dorothy more space to play. Continuing to write letters on the page, he reflects that now he has both a family and a house, yet he still desires another goal. Now he wants to read. A gentle smile appears on his face. Among everything he has gained, however, he knows there is one thing he treasures most. His gaze shifts toward Lizzie. She continues helping him study patiently. Watching her, he realizes how hard she has worked throughout the day. She must be exhausted. Juwon reaches forward and places his hands on her shoulders. Lizzie jumps slightly in surprise. Then he begins gently massaging them. The tension soon leaves her body. She softly thanks him as a faint blush spreads across her cheeks. His hands feel warm and comforting. The atmosphere becomes peaceful and intimate as they spend the evening quietly together, gradually growing closer. The following morning, the old village chief rides inside a carriage. A tired sigh escapes him. He complains internally that reaching a major city where his informant lives requires an entire day and a half of travel. Rubbing his aching back, he grumbles that less than half a day has passed and his body already hurts. Then his expression becomes serious. After paying for transportation and purchasing information from his contact, the trip had better be worthwhile. A greedy smile slowly forms on his face. Most healing mages he has encountered are physically weak and unimpressive. Juan is completely different. The village chief reflects that he has never seen a healing mage as enormous or as powerful. Looking at him, his smile widens. He becomes convinced that information about someone like Juan could earn him at least a dozen gold coins. Beside him in the carriage, two passengers discuss recent events. One man wonders what will happen next and asks whether their country should summon a hero as well. The other says that the kingdom has apparently attempted hero summoning several times already. The first passenger leans closer and says that he heard the temple successfully summoned one. He wonders whether the hero who appeared in the neighboring enemy nation might actually be a fraud. The second man laughs and says that nobody truly knows whether heroes even exist. He points out that the heroes from the legends lived centuries ago. According to the old stories, they possess appearances different from ordinary people. He concludes that if any supposed hero is fake, the truth will eventually come out. Hearing their discussion, the village chief frowns. He realizes that he had forgotten how close this region is to enemy territory. After living in isolation for so many years, he had stopped paying attention to larger political affairs. Anxiety enters his expression. He decides that he must sell the information, collect his reward, and return home as quickly as possible. Nobody knows when war might begin. The carriage continues rolling along the road. Back at home, Dorothy is busy playing with the rabbit. Crouching beside its basket, she asks if it feels bored. Giggling, she says that she will play with it. At that moment, Lizzie enters the room and immediately warns Dorothy that the rabbit is not meant for eating. Dorothy looks utterly confused and asks if her mother is being silly. Lizzie blinks in surprise. Dorothy explains that she already knows baby rabbits are not for eating. Lizzie points toward Dorothy's mouth and says that if she truly knows that, she should wipe away her drool first. Embarrassed, Dorothy quickly wets her mouth. Then she suddenly remembers something important. The bunny needs food. Jumping to her feet, she announces that she's going outside to feed it. The moment she steps outdoors, something catches her attention. Her eyes widen as she sees Juwan building a fence nearby. Since they already have a house, she cannot understand why he is constructing one. She watches him briefly before remembering her original goal. Laughing at herself, she hurries toward the rabbit enclosure. When she arrives, she stares at the larger rabbits living there and comments that they are still big and ugly. Even so, she places food down for them. Afterward, she kneels beside her own rabbit and tells it that she is busy today, so it must eat by itself and behave properly. Carefully, she divides the food equally. Then another idea suddenly enters her mind. It seems that she can use magic too. A huge grin spreads across her face. She decides that she will proudly tell her father later. Her imagination quickly runs wild, and she wonders if her magic might even work on wolf meat. The more she thinks about it, the more excited she becomes. Meanwhile, Lizzie sits inside the house holding preserved wolf pelts and a preserved wolf head. She reflects that a merchant caravan should arrive in the village soon. A worried expression appears on her face. If they cannot purchase the necessary supplies, it will become a serious problem. Her gaze shifts toward one of the wolf pelts. She knows merchants place great value on them. A gentle smile forms as she remembers that it came from the very first wolf Juwan ever hunted. Part of her does not want to sell it. Unfortunately, reality soon returns. They still need too many things. Juwan requires more clothes. He also needs proper shoes. They could use additional buckets, pots, cooking ingredients, and other household supplies as well. After considering everything, she sighs. A single rabbit pelt will not be enough. Determination fills her eyes. Lizzie ties back her hair, picks up a pair of scissors, and gets to work. Sometime later, the front door opens. Juwan announces that he has returned home. Dorothy immediately runs toward him while happily calling for her father. Lizzie turns and warmly welcomes him home. However, the instant Juwan sees her, he freezes. His eyes widen in shock. Dorothy dramatically points toward her mother and solemnly announces that Mommy's hair is gone. Juwan remains speechless as he stares at Lizzie in disbelief. Juwan stared at Lizzie in stunned silence. Her appearance had changed so much that he barely recognized her. Nearby, Dorothy circled around her mother with wide, curious eyes before asking where her long hair had gone. Lizzie smiled awkwardly and explained that she had cut it. Dorothy immediately pouted and said that her mother's long hair had been beautiful. Watching the exchange, Juwan slowly realized what had happened. Dorothy lowered her head and admitted that she had felt sorry about Lizzie's hair. Without another word, Juwan stepped closer and gently cupped Lizzie's cheek. He quietly apologized to her. Lizzie blinked in confusion, unable to understand why he was apologizing. As she looked into his eyes, she couldn't help thinking that he truly was a strange man. In this world, long hair was more than a symbol of beauty. Most women grew it so they could sell it whenever their families desperately needed money. It was another means of survival, and almost no one would apologize when someone cut it off. Yet, Juwan did. His concern wasn't the lost money, but her. Lizzie's vision blurred as emotion welled up inside her. His simple kindness touched her heart in a way she had never expected. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around him. She buried her face against his chest and explained that she wasn't crying from sadness, but from happiness. She admitted that her heart had never felt so warm. Juwan silently embraced her in return. Beside them, Dorothy watched with a delighted smile. Seeing her parents together made her happier than anything else. A while later, the family headed toward the nearby town. Dorothy happily sat on Juwan's shoulders and invited Lizzie to climb up as well. Lizzie laughed softly and refused, saying that together they would be too heavy. Juwan adjusted Dorothy on his shoulders, and the three continued walking while chatting and laughing, surrounded by a peaceful atmosphere. When they reached town, they were greeted by crowded streets filled with merchants, travelers, children, and adventurers. Vendors loudly advertised their goods while customers wandered from stall to stall. The lively scene felt strangely familiar to Juwan. Dorothy's eyes sparkled as she eagerly declared that she wanted something delicious to eat. As he quietly observed the bustling streets, memories from his previous life surfaced. He wondered how long it had been since he had walked through such a crowded place. Before coming to this world, he had always wandered through crowds completely alone. Now he glanced at Lizzie beside him and Dorothy. A warm smile spread across his face as he realized that he finally understood what it meant to walk together as a family. His thoughts were interrupted when Dorothy suddenly pointed toward a nearby stall. She jumped down and ran toward it while merchants continued shouting for customers. As soon as she arrived, she stopped. Standing before her was a little boy around her own age. The two children quietly stared at one another until Dorothy tilted her head and remarked that he looked like someone. The confused boy asked what she meant. Nearby, Lizzie smiled as she watched the children interact, while Juwan silently wondered whether Dorothy thought the boy resembled him. Lizzie then approached a merchant and carefully placed rabbit pelt in her hair on his counter. The shopkeeper inspected them before letting out an exaggerated sigh. He claimed that rabbit pelts had become common lately and that prices had dropped. Lizzie looked disappointed. Privately, however, the merchant admired the pelts. Their fur was thick, glossy, and exceptionally high quality. Determined to exploit her ignorance, he insisted that they were worth very little and claimed he could only exchange them for a few cheap goods. Convinced she was about to accept, he secretly celebrated the easy profit. Then he noticed Juwan standing behind her. His smile vanished instantly. He had never seen such a massive man before. As the merchant reached for the pelts, Juwan calmly grabbed his wrist. The merchant froze. He instinctively tried to pull away but couldn't move his arm at all. Shocked by Juwan's overwhelming strength, he stared at him in disbelief. Juwan calmly told Lizzie that they should leave and sell the pelts somewhere else because the merchant was lying. The merchant immediately panicked, while Lizzie hesitated, reminding Juwan that the next town was far away. Juwan answered that the distance didn't matter. He explained that the rabbit pelts were in excellent condition and that the merchant had deliberately deceived her. Lizzie finally realized she had nearly been cheated simply because she lacked experience dealing with merchants. The shopkeeper hurriedly denied everything before instantly changing his attitude. He claimed he would accept a loss by including salt, a cooking pot, and a complete set of men's clothing. Inwardly, he wondered why he had backed himself into such a terrible bargain. Lizzie gently shook her head and told Juwan they should find someone who would pay honestly. As they turned to leave, the merchant jumped over the counter in desperation. He admitted that the pelts were among the finest he had seen all day. Watching them walk away, he grabbed his head in frustration, realizing he had lost an incredible opportunity. Meanwhile, Dorothy proudly pointed toward Juwan while speaking to the other children, repeatedly telling them that he was her father. When Lizzie called her back, Dorothy happily waved goodbye while continuing to boast about her dad before running after her parents. Later, the family walked home with Dorothy wrapped safely inside Juwan's coat. She smiled contentedly, saying that it smelled nice and made her feel safe because her incredibly strong father was protecting her. After a moment, she suddenly noticed how warm it was inside the coat. Realizing she was tucked beneath it, she poked her head out and asked Juwan to put her down because she needed to feed the rabbit. Juwan smiled and gently lowered her to the ground. Dorothy grabbed a bundle of fresh grass and happily ran toward the rabbit enclosure. The moment she arrived, she froze. The enclosure was completely empty. She stared in disbelief before tears quickly filled her eyes. Crying that the rabbits were gone, she turned and ran back toward the house. Lizzie immediately noticed her distress and asked what had happened. Still sobbing, Dorothy cried that the rabbits had disappeared. Juwan walked over and asked what was wrong. After hearing Dorothy explain, he looked toward the empty enclosure. Before he could comfort her, he noticed something unexpected. Lizzie was crying as well. Confused, Juwan asked why she was crying too. Through her tears, Lizzie answered that the rabbit was gone. Juwan looked back and forth between the two of them, both weeping over the missing rabbits. For a brief moment, he was speechless before a quiet laugh escaped him. Dorothy immediately pouted and complained that she hated him for laughing. Juwan quickly explained that he wasn't laughing at them. Deep inside, however, warmth filled his heart. Watching Lizzie and Dorothy cry over something as simple as rabbits made him realize how precious his family had become. Laughing together, crying together, and caring about the smallest things, that was what family truly felt like. Far away in the mountains, old Gus remained hidden behind a massive boulder. His breathing stayed calm as he carefully observed several goblins moving through the forest. His sharp gaze continued searching until it settled on a hidden settlement filled with wooden huts, watchtowers, and dozens of goblins. A cold smile spread across his face as he realized he had finally found the goblin village. His grip tightened around his wooden staff while murderous intent flickered in his eyes. He admitted that he wanted nothing more than to charge in and slaughter every goblin immediately, but he knew it would only be suicide. Instead, he carefully studied the overcrowded settlement. He observed that it had already reached its limit. Once food and women became scarce, the goblins would inevitably begin fighting among themselves. His smile grew colder as he concluded that if even a single goblin lost control and attacked the village, the entire settlement would descend into chaos. Old Gus had spent years studying goblins and understood them better than most. He knew that individually they were far weaker than most demonic beasts or monsters. On their own, they were hardly threatening. What made them terrifying was their numbers. His eyes swept across the countless goblins filling the settlement. Even while constantly dying in battle, they multiplied at an unbelievable rate, making their losses almost meaningless. Disgust filled his voice as he reflected on how goblins kidnapped women from every corner of the land and forced them to bear endless offspring. Painful memories surfaced in his mind. Those broken, battered women were condemned to give birth until their bodies finally gave out. He lowered his head, knowing their suffering was beyond words. Looking back at the camp, old Gus clenched his teeth. He knew that once spring arrived, the goblins would no longer be able to suppress their breeding instincts. He quietly declared that he had to destroy them before that happened. After a long silence, another face entered his thoughts. Juwan. Old Gus sighed heavily. He admitted that his plan depended on Juwan's strength. Guilt weighed on him every time he remembered how sincerely Juwan thanked him for every lesson. He closed his eyes briefly before accepting that there was no other choice. When he opened them again, they were filled with resolve. The only solution was to make Juwan kill the goblins. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere was completely different. Lizzie had just woken from her nap. After stretching and yawning, she noticed someone outside. Curious, she walked to the entrance and immediately gasped. Juwan was standing there in front of some hanged rabbits. Juwan smiled and greeted her. Lizzie happily walked over and asked whether he had caught another rabbit. His thoughts instantly returned to the exhausting chase. He had spent hours sprinting through the forest, crashing through bushes, stumbling over rocks, and repeatedly failing to catch the unbelievably fast animal. He had stubbornly refused to give up because he wanted to bring it back alive. After countless failed attempts, he had finally succeeded. Returning to the present, he simply smiled and modestly said that it had not taken long. Lizzie looked genuinely impressed. She gently stroked the rabbit's soft fur before asking whether they should salt it or roast it. Juwan asked her to prepare it with salt before correcting himself, realizing she did not understand what roasting meant. He explained that they would salt it first and then roast it. Lizzie happily promised to make it delicious. Juwan smiled, imagining the bamboo aroma soaking into the meat while the vegetables stuffed inside enhanced its flavor. Soon he began preparing the fire. After a while, he frowned. The flames had weakened again. Looking at his fingers, he muttered that his strange gift felt unreliable. Even so, he focused on cooking the rabbit before Lizzie and Dorothy became hungry. Suddenly, powerful flames burst from his fingertips. Juwan's eyes widened. He hurriedly pointed away from the rabbit, insisting that the fire could not burn the meal he had prepared for his family. Staring at his hand in disbelief, he wondered why the magic suddenly worked after refusing to respond earlier. Slowly calming himself, he concluded that activating the magic was not entirely under his control. Then he remembered the giant wolf. The first time he had used fire magic, he had never felt flames gathering in his hand. Instead, they had appeared directly on the wolf's body. His eyes widened. He realized the fire might not originate from his hands at all. Instead, it seemed to manifest directly on its target, which also explained why his own body never suffered burns. Curiosity replaced his confusion. Closing his eyes, he pictured the rabbit in his mind. He carefully imagined gentle flames wrapping around the meat, cooking it evenly instead of burning it. The instant the image became clear, soft orange flames suddenly surrounded the rabbit without touching anything else. The magical fire wrapped around the meat like invisible hands, roasting every side perfectly. Juwan stared in amazement. The rabbit slowly rotated above the fire while golden fat dripped onto the coals, filling the cabin with a mouth-watering aroma. Unable to hide his excitement, he happily declared that he had finally figured out how to use his fire magic. Looking proudly at the beautifully roasted rabbit, he could hardly believe he had made a perfect rotisserie roast. A short while later, he carried the meal inside. The delicious aroma instantly filled the cabin. Dorothy's eyes sparkled while Lizzie covered her mouth in surprise, amazed by the smell. The rabbit's crispy golden skin glistened beneath the firelight. Dorothy curiously wondered whether it was chicken before realizing it was an entire roasted animal. Without another word, Juwan effortlessly split the rabbit into 2 equal portions and handed one piece to each of them. Both hesitated briefly before taking a bite. The moment the juicy meat touched their tongues, their eyes widened. Rich flavors of bamboo and herbs spread through every bite. They froze before happily exclaiming that it was delicious. Dorothy eagerly stuffed her cheeks with food while Lizzie slowly savored every bite with a warm smile. Juan quietly watched them. Although he had barely eaten, seeing the two people he loved enjoy his cooking filled his own heart completely. Simply watching them was enough to make him happy. Over the following days, Juan practiced his fire magic whenever he had spare time. Each attempt became smoother. Before long, he discovered that controlling the magic had become surprisingly easy. Stretching his hand toward a nearby boulder nearly half a meter away, he focused for a moment. A small flame instantly appeared on the boulder's surface. Juan smiled confidently. He realized he could now cast fire directly onto a target about 50 centimeters away. Then another thought crossed his mind. If the same magic could be used on living creatures, his expression turned serious. It would become an incredibly terrifying ability. The thought sent a chill through him, but he quickly dismissed it. Instead, he looked toward the cabin where Lizzie and Dorothy laughed together. His gaze softened as he silently vowed that, with both healing and fire magic, he would protect them no matter what. His thoughts drifted back to his previous life and the mysterious Santa Claus who had changed everything. Smiling faintly, he wondered whether those powers had been Santa's gift so he could finally protect his family and live happily. A humorous thought followed. He scratched his cheek and wondered whether, when Christmas arrived, he should hold a memorial service for Santa just as people honored their ancestors. He quietly laughed to himself. Just then, Dorothy's excited voice echoed from inside the cabin. She exclaimed that the rabbit had woken up. Juan blinked and hurried inside. The rabbit he had captured earlier was sitting in her basket while Dorothy proudly held it in her arms. She happily announced that she would give Mr. Stas Bunny a tour of the house. Without waiting, she carefully introduced the kitchen, explaining that it was where food was made and that it was the most important room. The rabbit merely twitched its nose. Dorothy then seriously introduced a wall before continuing her grand tour. Finally, she carried the rabbit over to Lizzie. Holding it close to her, Dorothy proudly explained that she wanted to introduce someone very important. She happily declared that Lizzie was her mother and insisted that Mr. Bunny must never forget her. Lizzie's face immediately turned bright red. At that moment, Juan walked inside. Dorothy quickly turned toward him and proudly announced that the rabbit was now her junior disciple. Juan blinked in confusion and asked what she meant. Lizzie remained speechless, her cheeks burning crimson. Juan slowly looked from Dorothy to Lizzie. Then an astonishing thought suddenly entered his mind. His heart began racing. He carefully walked over, knelt in front of Lizzie, and stared at her with trembling excitement. Swallowing nervously, he slowly reached toward her stomach and wondered whether there was a baby growing inside her small, fragile body. Juan stared at Lizzie in confusion. Noticing his reaction, she hurriedly shook her head and clarified that she had not meant a baby, only a word. He sighed softly, admitting that it was still too early for children. With a faint smile, he thought that when they eventually had one, he wanted it to happen after they had found a safer home where their family would no longer struggle to survive. Dorothy suddenly tugged at his sleeve and asked why he was kneeling. Her cheerful smile immediately cleared his troubled thoughts. More than anything, he wanted to deepen his bond with her and give her all the affection she had been denied. Dorothy raised the horned rabbit and happily pointed out that Juan was posing exactly like it. He chuckled, but his attention soon shifted to the creature's horn, which had grown considerably since he first found it. At the time, he had ignored it. This world contained enormous wolves, monsters, and magic, so a rabbit with a horn had hardly seemed strange. Still, his smile faded as he wondered whether continuing to raise it was truly safe. He had considered releasing it into the forest and had even thought about killing it before it became dangerous. However, Dorothy was already deeply attached to it, and Lizzie had also opposed getting rid of it. In the end, he abandoned the idea. Aside from its horn, it behaved like an ordinary gentle rabbit. Juan wished Gus were there so he could ask what kind of creature it was. The old hunter had not visited for 5 days, making him wonder whether Gus had traveled somewhere distant. His age and injured leg must have made climbing the mountains difficult. Juan looked down at his hands and decided that once he could safely reveal his healing magic, he should try restoring Gus's leg. Gus had taught him countless things and helped his family repeatedly. Juan wanted to repay that kindness. Since they had no relatives in this world, Gus could even become a grandfather to Dorothy and a father figure to Lizzie. However, magic users appeared extremely rare. If his healing abilities attracted attention, they would only invite danger. He needed to learn how to use magic without anyone noticing. Closing his eyes, Juan imagined creating flames inside an object while leaving no visible fire outside. He stretched a hand toward a pile of firewood and pictured its interior glowing like molten lava. After several seconds, he opened his eyes, only to find the wood unchanged. Frowning, he wondered whether his firepower was too weak or his visualization had been wrong. He sighed and prepared to give up when a sharp crackling sound filled the yard. The logs suddenly ignited from within. Startled, Juan seized a nearby bucket and drenched them. Steam rose as the flames vanished. He stared at the soaked wood before excitement lit his face. He had not failed. The fire had truly burned from the inside, exactly as intended. Before he could celebrate, Dorothy called for him and came running with a huge smile. She announced that it was time to eat and that Lizzie had prepared rabbit meat. Dorothy leaped toward him, and Juwan quickly caught her. He warned that jumping so high was dangerous, but she only giggled and complained that the food would grow cold. Smiling, he carried her toward the house. As they walked, however, something above the mountains caught his attention. Large flocks of birds were circling high in the sky. He had never seen them behave that way since arriving in this world. His expression grew uneasy, but Dorothy tugged at his sleeve again and urged him to hurry before the meat cooled. Juwan gave the mountains one final glance before agreeing to eat first. Just as they reached the house, a familiar voice called for him to come outside. Juwan stopped in surprise. Gus normally visited at dawn, so his arrival at this hour was unusual. Outside, he found the old hunter standing beside the newly built fence. Gus observed the construction and asked whether Juwan was building it. Juwan confirmed that he was, explaining that wolves were dangerous in the mountains and, after a pause, adding that strangers could be dangerous as well. He then asked why Gus had come so late. Gus immediately stated that he intended to teach him how to make a bow. When Juwan reacted with surprise, Gus explained that a proper bow could come later and that he only needed to learn the frame for now. Before Juwan could ask anything else, Gus insisted there was no time and ordered him to follow immediately. Juwan accompanied him to the cabin. Upon arriving, Gus picked up a thick log and an axe and instructed him to watch closely. He carved a sharp wooden wedge, placed it against the larger log, and hammered it deeper little by little instead of attempting to split the wood with one powerful strike. With every blow, the crack widened until the log separated cleanly. Gus explained that Juwan should never try to split it all at once but work gradually instead. Juwan understood that the wedges allowed the wood to divide naturally without relying on brute force. Gus handed him another log and ordered him to repeat the process. Juwan followed every step. His movements were awkward at first, but Gus silently corrected each error. Hours passed before they entered the cabin. Even there, the old hunter continued demonstrating technique after technique, telling Juwan to watch and remember everything. Juwan quietly studied him, yet the situation felt increasingly strange. Gus had claimed he would only teach him the basics of making a bow, but he was now passing on everything at once, almost as though he were running out of time. Unable to ignore his unease, Juwan asked whether something had happened or if the mountain was in danger. Gus denied it and questioned why he would think that. Juwan mentioned the birds he had seen circling above a distant mountain. Gus remained silent briefly before explaining that wolves lived throughout the area and had probably attacked someone. Although his tone was calm, his eyes narrowed for an instant. He retrieved a finished arrow from the corner and gave it to Juwan for practice. Juwan accepted it with both hands and thanked him. Gus announced that he was leaving and would teach him the rest another day. Juwan bowed respectfully and thanked him for everything before turning away. The old hunter watched him silently. After Juwan left, Gus recalled that several days earlier he had gone down to the village and informed the chief about the goblins. The chief had immediately sent his son to a town half a day away, where a small guild branch operated. Though the branch was not large, it responded quickly to reports involving goblins. Gus expected the guild to post a request and send experienced adventurers within a few days. Even so, he could not relax because goblins moved far faster than most people believed. The circling birds Juwan had seen were likely scavengers gathering around human corpses. Gus believed he knew exactly where the deaths had occurred. A group of 5 or 6 people had been hiding deep in the mountains near the goblin settlement. Most likely, a woman among them had attracted the goblins' attention. Once that happened, their fate had already been sealed. Silence filled the cabin as Gus coldly reflected that everything building beneath the surface would soon erupt, and the consequences would inevitably reach the village. His face remained emotionless as he accepted that sacrifices were necessary to achieve a goal. He believed Juwan would survive because he was strong. Even if Lizzie died, the loss would initially destroy him, but as long as he remained alive, he could eventually find another woman and create a new family. To Gus, that was merely a fact. He believed that hunters who followed their path to its end would eventually arrive at the greatest hunting ground of all. Slowly, he reached for the sword beside him and drew it, allowing the blade to reflect the sunlight. As someone who had spent his entire life hunting, he believed there could be no greater happiness. He swung the sword through the air with terrifying speed, never taking his eyes from the mountains. Later, during the cold morning, Lizzie stepped outside the cabin while wrapping a thick sweater around herself. Nearby, Juwan inspected the wooden fence surrounding their home, ensuring every post remained secure before winter worsened. Hearing Lizzie approach, he turned and worriedly asked why she had come outside in such freezing weather. Instead of answering, she smiled and offered him a small wooden bowl, telling him to eat. Juwan accepted it gratefully, thanked her, and urged her to return indoors before she became cold. Lizzie gently shook her head and insisted she would only go back after he finished. She admitted that she simply wanted to remain beside him a little longer. Her words caught Juwan completely off guard. A faint blush spread across his face as he smiled without even realizing it. Juwan and Lizzie sat beside the small campfire, warming themselves as icy wind swept through the trees. After tasting the meal, Juwan smiled and praised how delicious it was before thanking her. Lizzie quickly waved off his gratitude, saying that it was nothing and that she was simply happy he enjoyed it. Juwan fell silent, watching her gentle smile glow beneath the flickering firelight. He wondered how someone like him had ever become so fortunate. Moving behind her, he softly wrapped both arms around her shoulders and leaned close, telling her how grateful he always was for her. Lizzie's cheeks flushed bright red, resting her hands over his. The next morning, Juwan and Lizzie washed clothes beside the stream. Lizzie apologetically insisted that she could handle the work alone, but Juwan smiled and explained that finishing together would be faster. As he scrubbed another garment, he privately realized how valuable washing machines had been. They had soaked the clothes overnight in lye water, rinsed everything in freezing water that morning, and would hang it all to dry after sunrise. Watching Lizzie work without complaint, he could hardly believe she had managed the entire burden alone until now. Before he could speak, Dorothy called for him. She ran toward them while the small horned rabbit bounced happily beside her, insisting that he needed to treat it. Juwan blinked, suddenly remembering that he had forgotten. However, as he reached toward the rabbit, he noticed Dorothy holding a tiny cloth doll. When he asked about it, Dorothy proudly explained that her mother had made it the previous day and asked whether it was cute. Juwan smiled and agreed that it was adorable. He then bent down and touched the rabbit's fur. The instant his fingers made contact, a faint golden glow spread across its body. Juwan stared in amazement before noticing that its horn had disappeared again. Gus had never mentioned anything like that. While practicing archery the day before, Juwan had asked him about horned rabbits. Although he had not understood every detail, Gus had explained that they were demonic beasts commonly found in forests and fields. Wild demonic beasts were extremely dangerous, but those raised from infancy could become harmless companions. Some people even kept them as pets. Still, Gus had said nothing about glowing horns. Juwan wondered whether different breeds existed or if this particular rabbit was unusual. Staring into its eyes, he suspiciously asked why it was glowing and whether it was some strange mutant. His voice hardened as he warned it never to endanger Lizzie or Dorothy. The rabbit merely twitched its ears and squeaked. Juwan froze, surprised that a rabbit could make such a sound. Leaning closer, he asked whether it understood him. The creature only stared blankly. After waiting several seconds, Juwan sighed and concluded that it probably understood nothing. He decided to ask Gus later. Dorothy then excitedly tugged at his sleeve and demanded names for the rabbits. When Juwan asked whether she truly wanted to name them, she enthusiastically requested pretty names like her own. Juwan agreed that since Dorothy had a name, the little ones deserved them too. After thinking briefly, he named the baby rabbit Oz and the handmade rabbit doll Toto. Dorothy's face brightened. She repeatedly called them Oz and Toto while tightly hugging both. Her innocent laughter warmed Lizzie's heart. She smiled quietly, grateful that Dorothy could finally experience the peaceful childhood every child deserved. While happiness filled their remote cabin, fear spread throughout the village. Villagers gathered in the streets, whispering as rumors passed from house to house. One man asked whether the goblins might truly swarm the village. Another grimly confirmed the danger, reminding everyone that the chief's son had gone to the city to request guild reinforcements. A third villager recalled his grandfather's stories, warning that goblins slaughtered everyone except the women. The first man turned pale and suggested fleeing immediately. Another admitted that he was so terrified he doubted he could sleep. As panic grew, the village chief prepared his own escape. Standing beside a large public carriage, he impatiently demanded to know whether his wife had finished cleaning it. She complained that she already had enough work and questioned why she alone had to clean a public carriage no one used when it should have been everyone's responsibility. The chief snapped that if the filthy goblins invaded, they would need it to escape. His wife appeared confused, pointing out that there were supposedly only a dozen goblins and asking why they could not use their own cart. Calling her foolish, the chief explained that if they loaded their private cart with belongings, the villagers would accuse him of abandoning everyone. Lowering his voice, he instructed her to secretly pack food into the public carriage. She reluctantly agreed and left. Once alone, the chief clenched his fists, frustrated that nothing followed his plans. His meeting with the information broker had ended disastrously. Every village asked only one question about how powerful the mage was. None of them seemed to understand how incredibly rare a healing mage could be. His irritation deepened as he wondered why everything continued going wrong. Far inside the mountains, Gus hid among thick bushes and observed the goblin settlement. Several goblins were viciously fighting, striking one another with clubs and tearing at each other amid savage snarls. Gus knew they were naturally crude and violent, but the atmosphere felt different. A mutiny had begun. Their suppressed hunger and lust had finally erupted. Once rebellious goblins were expelled from the pack, their destination was obvious. They would head straight toward a village filled with women. Gus tightened his jaw. It was far too early. If the goblins moved before the adventurers arrived, his entire plan would collapse. His hand rested on a small object concealed inside his pocket. He wondered whether the moment had finally come to use what he had saved for such an emergency. However, he first needed somewhere suitable to divert them. Dorothy's image appeared in his mind. She was a little girl who rarely smiled and always hid indoors whenever strangers approached, as though she had forgotten how happiness felt. A trace of guilt crossed Gus's face before he suppressed it. He told himself that guilt no longer mattered. Objectively, Dorothy carried an outsider's blood and had no connection to the village. From the beginning, Juwon's wife and daughter had been intended as sacrifices. Yet even after accepting that conclusion, Gus's expression remained heavy. His thoughts drifted years into the past, recalling his father's warning that he had been trained as a hunter far too young. His father had said that, although Gus had become flawless at hunting, he had failed as a human because he had never experienced an ordinary life, and that this would only make him increasingly miserable. In that memory, Gus had rejected those words. He had insisted that his life was perfect because he possessed a goal worth dying for. Experiencing the ecstasy of achieving it would be true happiness. A faint smile touched his face as he thought about his disciple. Someone would now inherit every one of his hunting techniques. His teachings would become a brilliant seed, and through that boy he would create the ultimate hunter. Returning to the present, Gus opened his eyes and lost his smile. The goblins truly were moving toward the village. At that moment, an unusual sound emerged from inside his pocket. His gaze immediately dropped toward it. Elsewhere in the forest, Juwon crouched beside one of his snares. Another rabbit had become trapped. Without hesitation, he drew his dagger and ended its suffering with one clean motion. While wiping the blade, he noticed that he no longer hesitated as before. Even his disgust had faded. Looking down at the dead rabbit, he realized that he was unconsciously adapting to this world and changing in order to survive. As he continued through the forest, another thought entered his mind. He did not believe he'd always been this way. Glancing deeper among the trees, he noticed that he still had time before returning home. With a faint smile, he decided to take another route and search for better places to set additional snares. Without realizing it, that simple choice placed him on a path that could change everything. Juwon continued deeper into the dense forest, using a small wooden stick to sweep aside vines and bushes blocking his path. The farther he climbed into the mountains, the more unnaturally quiet the wilderness became. Looking around, he thought that this truly was untouched land, with absolutely no sign that another human had ever ventured there. After searching for some time without finding anything useful, he sighed in disappointment and concluded that there seemed to be nothing there. Just as he prepared to turn back, something suddenly shot past him at astonishing speed. Juwon spun around instinctively and focused on the fleeing figure. A gigantic roe deer had burst through the trees before vanishing farther into the forest. His eyes widened as he realized that a deer that large would provide far more meat than the wolf he had hunted before. Refusing to let such valuable prey escape, he immediately grabbed the bow hanging over his shoulder and pulled out an arrow. Keeping his gaze fixed on the running animal, he reminded himself to stay focused. If he remained calm, he believed he could still hit it even while it was moving. He took a breath and chased after the deer while drawing his bowstring. The animal slipped effortlessly between the trees, but Juwon stubbornly kept it in sight. As he closed the distance, he thought that he almost had it. Then his foot suddenly caught on a thick root hidden beneath the fallen leaves. Juwon stumbled forward and slammed into the ground, losing the arrow from his grasp. By the time he raised his head again, the deer had already disappeared. Frustration crossed his face as he cursed his luck, slowly got back up and brushed the dirt from his clothes. However, something nearby soon caught his attention. Several strange footprints stretched across the forest floor. Juwon crouched beside them and wondered what kind of creature had left such tracks. They clearly were not human, yet they looked unlike anything he had encountered before. His expression gradually hardened. Judging from how clearly the prints remained in the soil, he concluded that they could not have been made long ago. Without hesitation, he began following the trail deeper into the mountains. Elsewhere, old Gus was sprinting through the forest as quickly as his aging body could manage. His breathing was ragged, sweat streamed down his face, and behind him raced a large pack of goblins wearing vicious, bloodthirsty expressions. Yet Gus had not stumbled into them by accident. Everything was unfolding according to his plan. While running, he reached into his pouch, withdrew a small bag of fine powder, and scattered its contents across the ground behind him. It was musk deer powder. Its extremely powerful scent was enough to overwhelm goblins whose instincts had already taken control of them. The moment the creatures smelled it, their bloodshot eyes became even redder and their snarls intensified. Rather than slowing down, they charged after Gus with greater frenzy. A satisfied smile briefly appeared on the old hunter's face as he thought that they were almost there and urged the creatures, in his mind, not to become distracted and to keep following him. He continued guiding them toward his intended destination. Meanwhile, Juwon carefully followed the mysterious tracks, never taking his eyes from the ground. But with every step, the anxiety tightening his chest grew stronger. He wondered why he felt so restless and why he could not calm himself. Every instinct warned him that something was terribly wrong. Still, he followed the trail until he reached the edge of a rocky cliff. Looking below, he saw that the footprints continued farther down. Then he raised his head and studied the distant terrain. His eyes widened. Although he had never traveled this far before, he could roughly recognize where the route led. His heartbeat suddenly quickened. The tracks were heading directly toward his home. Realizing this, Juwon immediately jumped down from the rocks and broke into a desperate sprint. He did not know what creatures had made those footprints, but he was certain they were moving toward the shack where Lizzie and Dorothy were waiting. His breathing grew heavier with every stride. A fear unlike anything he had ever felt swallowed him completely. Juan pushed his exhausted body beyond its limits, ignoring branches tearing at his skin as he silently begged God, if he still existed somewhere in that world, not to take anything else away from him. With anguish filling his thoughts, he pleaded that if Lizzie and Dorothy were only going to be taken from him, then he should never have been given them in the first place. He desperately begged for their protection. Far from him, completely unaware of the approaching danger, Dorothy happily stood beside the cooking pot outside the cabin. Smiling at the small rabbit near her feet, she tells Oz that they are having stew that day and that everyone will eat together once her daddy returns home. The rabbit immediately began hopping toward the food. Dorothy puffed out her cheeks and scolded Oz that eating before everyone else would make him a bad bunny. She gently picked him up and informed him that he was already in serious trouble. Then she proudly showed him the tiny handmade kangaroo pouch in her clothes, explaining that her mommy had made the comfortable new bed especially for him. Afterward, Dorothy looked toward the front gate and happily announced that she was going to greet her daddy. From inside the cabin, Lizzie warmly tells Dorothy that she can go, but reminds her to be careful outside and not forget what her daddy taught her. Dorothy confidently assures her that she remembers. She then skipped cheerfully across the yard, unaware that danger was drawing closer with every passing second. While waiting near the gate, Dorothy happily explains to Oz that her daddy always becomes especially happy whenever she welcomes him home, so she can never skip greeting him. She folded her hands behind her back and waited patiently. Then several heavy knocks suddenly thundered against the wooden gate. Dorothy's eyes immediately brightened. Believing that her daddy had returned, she excitedly rushed toward the entrance, but just as her hand reached for the lock, she froze. A memory surfaced in her mind. She remembered Juan gently warning her that before opening the door, she must always check whether it was really him, because a frightening stranger might be outside instead. Dorothy quickly reminded herself that her daddy had told her never to open the gate immediately. She insisted to herself that she had not forgotten and had simply failed to think about it for a moment. Taking a careful breath, she leaned toward the narrow opening between the wooden boards. She remembered that whenever her daddy returned, he always lowered his face so she could see him through the gap and their eyes could meet immediately. Slowly, Dorothy peeked outside. Her cheerful expression vanished. Instead of Juan, a hideous green face with bloodshot eyes stared back at her. The goblin grinned grotesquely while fixing its gaze directly on the little girl. Dorothy instantly realized that it was not her daddy. Her entire body froze. The goblin slowly pushed one clawed hand through the opening and tried to seize her. Dorothy's heart hammered violently. She knew she needed to run, yet terror had locked her feet in place. Tears filled her eyes as her body refused to obey her. The goblin shoved harder against the gate, desperately trying to force its way inside. At that exact moment, Juan exploded from the forest at full speed. His breathing was ragged, and every muscle screamed from the relentless sprint. The instant he saw the front gate, his heart nearly stopped. A goblin stood directly outside his home, reaching toward Dorothy. He immediately recognized the creature. There was no time to think, no time to draw his bow, no time to aim. Only one thought remained in his mind. He had to protect his daughter. Juan desperately shouted Dorothy's name, his voice echoing across the mountains. The goblin instinctively turned toward him. That brief distraction was all he needed. Juan charged forward with everything he had, furiously ordering the creature to get away from his front door. Pouring every remaining ounce of strength into his legs, he launched himself into the air. Juan twisted mid-air and drove a brutal flying kick into the goblin's head. The impact sent the creature crashing several meters away, but he did not even stop to see whether it was dead. He rushed straight to Dorothy and tells her that her daddy is there before urgently asking if she is hurt. The moment Dorothy heard his voice, all her fear finally burst out. She cried in relief that her daddy had come and that she was thankful he was safe. Juan gently stroked her head and reassured her that everything was fine now because he was there, so she no longer needed to be afraid. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. Then countless growls echoed from the surrounding forest. Juan slowly raised his head, and his expression stiffened. One goblin became 2, then 5, then 10. Soon, dozens emerged from between the trees, surrounding the cabin from every direction. There were far more than he had expected. Keeping his eyes on them, Juan carefully moved Dorothy behind him and firmly tells her to stay inside and not come back out. He reached for the bow and arrows he had carried all day, but immediately realized they would be nearly useless against such numbers. Without hesitation, he threw them aside and instead tightened his grip around his weapon. The familiar weight steadied his racing heart as his fear transformed into fierce determination. His eyes filled with killing intent as he thought that he did not care whether there were dozens or even hundreds of them. He vowed to slaughter every last goblin surrounding his family and leave none alive. The monsters answered with furious roars before charging toward the cabin. Juan stepped forward without hesitation, ready to risk everything for the people behind him. Lizzie called Dorothy's name from inside. The moment she saw her daughter, she rushed over and wrapped her in a tight embrace. Seeing Dorothy alive finally shattered the fear Lizzie had been desperately suppressing. Dorothy also burst into tears and tells her mother that her dad had returned. She says that she had been terrified, but she was safe now. Yet even while held in her mother's arms, Dorothy could not stop trembling. She wondered why she was still crying. There were so many monsters outside while her father was fighting completely alone. A painful memory suddenly surfaced. She feared that Juwan might end up like her previous father, who had died in the mountains. The possibility that her new father could also disappear filled her with unbearable terror. Meanwhile, countless goblins continued rushing toward Juwan. Gripping his massive axe tightly, he cut through them one after another without hesitation. Each powerful swing sent another goblin crashing to the ground. But as the battle dragged on, wounds accumulated across Juwan's body and blood began streaming from him. Even after killing many of them, he noticed something disturbing. None of the goblins were afraid. No matter how many fell, the others never hesitated. Instead, they kept advancing with twisted smiles across their faces. The instant Juwan saw those expressions, he understood. They were not after him. Their true targets were his wife and daughter. That realization completely changed his expression. He charged forward with renewed fury and roared for the goblins to die. At that moment, an enormous wave of blazing fire erupted around him. Flames exploded across the battlefield, sweeping through the charging goblins one after another. The monsters were swallowed by the scorching inferno as the relentless fire tore through their ranks without mercy. Back near the cabin, Dorothy and Lizzie stood together in terror, unable to look away from the chaos surrounding them. Then they noticed several goblins trying to force their way through the fence. Seeing them getting closer, Lizzie urgently tells Dorothy to hurry inside. She orders her daughter to lock the door and hide beneath the bed. Dorothy immediately asks what her mother is going to do. Without hesitation, Lizzie tells her that she is going to help her father and again orders her to get inside. But a goblin was already closing in. Realizing there was no time left, Lizzie screams for Dorothy to enter the cabin immediately. Thinking of her husband fighting desperately outside, Lizzie grabbed a long bamboo spear. Only one thought filled her mind. Juwan was fighting dozens of goblins alone, so even if she could only drive back the ones entering the yard, she had to help him somehow. Gathering all her strength, she thrust the bamboo spear at the nearest goblin. The point struck its arm and drew blood, but the attack barely affected it. The creature simply grabbed the spear with one hand. Lizzie's heart sank when she realized she could not pull the weapon free. Dorothy watched everything unfold in horror. Tears filled her eyes as she thought that the monsters were trying to enter their home and that she was terrified. Yet an even greater fear consumed her. She imagined those creatures eating her mother and father and making them disappear forever. Unable to endure it any longer, Dorothy collapsed to the ground and repeatedly cried for both of them. Suddenly, Oz dashed forward at incredible speed. Dorothy panicked and warned the little rabbit that it was dangerous, desperately telling it to come back. But Oz refused. The tiny creature leaped onto the goblin and repeatedly scratched at its face, fearlessly refusing to retreat. Seeing Oz fighting so bravely gave Dorothy a spark of courage, and she excitedly cheers for him to continue. Lizzie also stared at the unexpected scene. At that exact moment, Juwan noticed the goblin threatening them. Without hesitation, he swung his massive axe with tremendous force and cleanly severed the creature's neck. The goblin collapsed instantly, allowing Oz to leap safely back to the ground. Dorothy's face immediately brightened. She exclaims that Oz was amazing and proudly says that she would do her best too. Then she spotted another goblin climbing over the fence and quickly warned everyone about the approaching monster. Looking toward her brave little companion, Dorothy declares that she and Oz would fight as one body and one mind. After a long struggle, the battle finally ended. Silence settled over the area as Juwan stood surrounded by the corpses of defeated goblins. From nearby, he heard Lizzie repeatedly calling his name. He immediately went to her and pulled her tightly into his arms, telling her how relieved he was that she had not been hurt. As he held her, countless emotions overwhelmed him. Juwan wanted to say more but found that his voice would no longer come out properly. Before long, Dorothy rushed over as well and wrapped her arms around him. Looking at his daughter, Juwan gently asks whether she had been frightened. Seeing both Dorothy and Lizzie alive before him, he finally released a long breath of relief and quietly thanked God, expressing how grateful he was that everyone had survived safely. However, his expression soon became serious again as he looked toward the mountain. He warns them that they still could not relax. They needed to leave the mountain while daylight remained because the creatures might become even more active at night, when humans would be at a severe disadvantage. Juwan knew the descent would likely be dangerous and chaotic. Even so, after a short silence, he softly says that before they leave, he wants them to remain together like that for just a little longer.